Chapter 156. As soon as he walked into the clouds on the mountainside, Ning Ke heard the sound of horse hooves behind him. The memories of fear that had been buried deep in his heart all these years suddenly awakened with the familiar sound of hooves, and then uncontrollably spread out, instantly occupying his entire body, causing his body to become incomparably stiff. He bit the tip of his tongue hard and used his extremely strong willpower to break free from the fear. He forced himself to turn his body and look back. The mountain path that should have been shrouded in the thick twilight had disappeared, and the clouds and mist had also disappeared. When they looked back, they saw a magnificent city standing between heaven and earth, a huge shadow blocking the official road to the north. On the official road, dozens of black armored cavalries were galloping over. The sound of horse hooves was like thunder, and the surface of the official road slightly shook. Pedestrians hurriedly avoided them. Ning Ke hid behind the table and chair in the tea shop, staring blankly at the cavalries galloping into the distance. Suddenly, he noticed that he was much shorter than the warhorses and the pedestrians on the road. He looked down and saw only a small shoe on his foot. His left foot had been pricked by a stone on the road and was bleeding. After leaving Chang'an, he followed the travelers all the way to the north. After being asked twice by those curious Tang citizens, he discovered the danger and quietly left the crowd one night. In the wild, he did not encounter any beasts. He could pick up fruits and fill his stomach, although hunger would always accompany him. When he came out of the forest with a sallow and thin face, he was about to reach the territory of Hebei province. At that time, he would no longer have to worry about being recognized, because there were sallow and thin faces like him all over the mountains and plains on both sides of the road. The Tang Empire faced a rare natural disaster in the wilderness and Hebei province in the first year of Tianqi era. The new emperor had just ascended the throne when he faced the first big test of his reign. His Majesty, who had rushed back to Chang'an from the Great Zhe, urgently began to arrange disaster relief. The refugees in the wilderness had already entered Hebei province, and the victims of the disaster in Hebei province were heading south. Those who were lucky enough to arrive first received relief from the imperial court, while those who were still within the borders of Hebei province and around the vast Min mountain faced a more severe test. Around the official road, the imperial officials and bailiffs were counting the number of refugees and distributing porridge. More and more refugees were migrating from the north to the south. To the people at that time, the north was the underworld of the human world, the most terrifying world. While everyone else was heading south, Ning Ke continued north and entered the territory of Hebei province. He trudged along the road at the foot of Min mountain. On the road, he encountered bandits with bad intentions and hid in the bushes to avoid them. But in the bushes, he saw many cold corpses. In a forest where the bark was almost peeled clean, he was surrounded by a group of starving people who were as thin as sticks. Judging from their clothes, these starving people should be from the northern Yan kingdom. The Yan royal family was unable to help them, so these starving people naturally came to the Tang Empire. It's a pity that he's just a kid. He doesn't have much meat on him. The starving people looked at the little boy who was covered in mud. The leader's eyes were glowing with green light, which was very much like the wolf Ning Ke would be very familiar with in the future. However, this wolf was also very thin, and its fur was quite festering. We don't have any strength left. Take off your clothes and jump into the pot. The leader of the starving people stuck his fingers into his mouth, as if he wanted to pull out a few shreds of meat. He looked at the little boy and said weakly, "Be careful when you jump in. Don't splash too much water out." These days, no one has extra strength to cut firewood and boil water. The 7 or 8 starving people around the little boy nodded slowly, like corpses that could barely move. Ning Ke looked at them and said, "You don't have any strength, but I do." The leader of the starving people laughed as if he was crying. He stretched out a withered finger and pointed at the little boy's face. He said, "If you still have strength, why don't you run away quickly?" Ning Ke did not say anything more. He took out the hatchet that he had carried all the way from behind his waist, and with all the strength he had accumulated by eating fruits, weeds, and a few handfuls of rice saved by kind-hearted people, he jumped up and fiercely waved the hatchet at the leader's nose. He was too young, too small, and too weak. Even if he jumped, he couldn't jump very high. However, the starving people in the forest had been starved for too many days and had long lost their strength. They could only watch helplessly as he swung the hatchet. With a puff, the little boy missed his target. The hatchet that had intended to cut off the leader's nose stabbed into his eye socket. Because of the hunger, the leader's eye socket was very clear. The scene of the hatchet cutting into the eye socket was very clear, and so was the sound. The rusty edge of the hatchet directly penetrated his eyeball and then went deep into his brain. The leader of the starving people fell straight like a piece of wood without making a sound. Ning Kai panted and walked forward. He stepped on the leader's neck with his little foot and pulled the hatchet out. As he moved, a greenish-yellow liquid flew into the air, but it was not blood. He knew that as the rain fell, the adults who came back to life and were healthier than before could become his enemies at any time. There were many corpses piled up on the side of the road in front of them. The skinny corpses had long rotted and were soaked in the rain, emitting a foul stench. A few similarly skinny wild dogs were squatting beside the corpses and eating. One of the wild dogs had its head tilted and was biting a bony arm that was exposed. It was forcefully dragging it backward, letting out a low growl from time to time. Another wild dog was squatting like a human, its two front paws resting on a skinny, rotten thigh as it gnawed on it. Hearing Ning Kai's footsteps, the few wild dogs stopped eating and raised their heads vigilantly. They stared at the little boy on the road and let out a low and terrifying whimper. Two wild dogs judged that the little boy's body shape could not pose any threat to them. They even gave up on the disgusting rotting corpses in front of them and began to approach Ning Quebec. Ning Kai used the wooden stick in his hand to stomp on the ground, and then took out the hatchet behind his waist. He lowered his body, revealing his slightly swollen and bleeding teeth, and fiercely barked at the two wild dogs. Probably because they smelled the stench of blood on the little boy's body and sensed that the other party possessed a level of danger that was different from his size, the few wild dogs retreated with a squeak and scattered around the pile of corpses, no longer eating. They were prepared to continue after he left. The rotting corpses beside the road and the domestic dogs that were supposed to guard the house had become wild dogs that hunted for rotting corpses. Ning Kai had seen many such scenes along the way and had long become numb to it. He did not feel anything at all, so he decided to leave immediately. Otherwise, if he really fought with these wild dogs, he might become one of these rotting corpses in the next moment. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly heard a very faint sound. He looked back at the rotting corpses that were soaked in the rain and found no movement. He was ready to leave again. Just as he was about to leave again, the faint sound rang again. This time it was very clear. It was the sound of crying. He walked back to the rotting corpses that were soaked in the rain and roared. He waved the wooden stick and hatchet to drive away the wild dogs that felt that their food had been occupied. Then he used the hatchet to chop off a rotten thigh and threw it far away into the dry field that had accumulated rain. The wild dogs whimpered and ate around the rotten thigh, ignoring his actions for the time being. Listening to the faint sound of crying coming from below the rotting corpses, Ning Kai began to move the corpses on the top. His strength was indeed very weak. Fortunately, these dead people were all skin and bones when they died. At this time, most of their internal organs had rotted into water vapor, so it was not too difficult to move. Wherever he touched was wet and slippery, like some kind of oily mud that he ate during the New Year in Chang'an City. Ning Kai shook off the rotten flesh on his hand and continued to move. At last, he finally saw the owner of the faint cry. There was a body lying in the field with its back bent. The body was wearing the clothes of a servant. After flipping the body over, they saw the little baby soaked in the rainwater and corpse fluid. The little baby's face was pale, her lips were black and blue, her eyes were tightly closed, and her breath was very weak. It was hard to imagine how she survived and how she could make such a cry just now. Ning Ke wiped the rotten flesh on his hand on his pants and then carefully picked up the baby. After a long silence, he looked at her and said, "You cried because you don't want me to leave, right?" He jumped off the rotting corpses with the baby in his arms and walked away along the road. The wild dogs that had been staring at him for a long time with green light in their eyes, seeing that he had finally left, let out a happy whimper and ran back to the rotting corpses. After a while, there was a sound of cooing. Without a sound, the heavy rain began to fall again. Ning Ke glanced at Min Mountain in the distance and looked down at the pale baby. He thought that if he let her stay in the rain for a while longer, she might not be able to cry anymore. He wanted to find something to shelter himself from the rain, and then he saw a black umbrella by the side of the road. The black umbrella was big, old, and dirty. The mountain road was still foggy. Ning Ke lowered his head slightly and stood between the steep stone steps, unable to move for a long time. With a swoosh, an arrow accurately hit a gray rabbit. Ning Ke walked forward like lightning and happily picked up the gray rabbit. He twisted his hands and broke the rabbit's neck neatly. Then he threw it into the bag behind him. The bag behind the lad was heavy. It seemed that there was a lot of game in it. Crouching at the foot of the tree and smelling it, he plucked the vines behind it, and climbed up the cliff by a steep path. In the meadow near the spring, he saw with satisfaction the best he had done in the last 3 days. A rock goat was lying on the ground, crying out in pain. 2 young goats were looking at it helplessly, using their heads to poke its nose from time to time. No one knew if they were trying to give it some strength and confidence, or if they were trying to comfort its dying kin. Ning Ke quietly walked forward and picked up the end of a rope in the grass. With a sudden pull, the beast-catching rope hidden in the grass was suddenly tightened. The 2 lambs screamed and fell down heavily, their hooves tightly tied together. The big rock goat whose hind legs were caught in the animal trap struggled desperately. It looked at the lambs whose hooves were tied and cried out anxiously. "You're lucky. At least someone is worried about you." Ning Ke walked to the animal trap and looked at the 2 lambs in the grass. He shook his head and pulled out a knife from his waist and pierced the big rock goat's neck. "I'm back." Ning Ke dragged the carcass of the rock goat, carried the heavy bag and led the 2 lambs back to the old hunting house in the forest. A little girl ran out to greet him. She was about 4 or 5 years old and wore animal skin. Her skin was dark. The hunting house was old and dim. The old hunter who sat by the copper brazier put down his pipe and looked at Ning Ke expressionlessly. He spat on the ground and said, "How's the harvest today?" "Not bad," Ning Ke said. The old hunter's face was full of wrinkles. One could never hope to see any kindness on his face. All one could see was greed and coldness. "Let's eat." The old hunter grabbed a piece of meat and ate it. He felt that the taste was not right and scolded, "This damn girl. I told you to put less salt. Salt is so expensive. Who gives you money? You wastrel. You only know how to eat and use my things. After I raise you for another 2 years, I'll sell you to the brothel for money." The little girl lowered her head and her eyes were full of fear. Ning Ke lowered his head and looked at the bowl of potato porridge that looked like a clear soup. His gaze was reflected in the water, and he could vaguely see the sparks that looked like stars. He had been reprimanded like this for many years. The old hunter ate meat while he and Sang Sang did not even have meat soup to drink. He had endured such treatment for many years. He was used to it, but it seemed that he could not get used to it forever. Little Sang Sang held the bowl of porridge with her 2 small hands. Her slender arms trembled and she suddenly coughed. Ning Ke reached out and stabilized the bowl for her. The old hunter drank a mouthful of strong wine and looked at them drunkenly. He said, "At least you are sensible. If the bowl were to break, how would I deal with her?" Ning Ke looked at the bowl of meat in front of the old hunter and stood up to walk over. He said sincerely, "Grandpa, Sangsang's illness acted up again last night. Do you think we should let her eat a piece of meat?" The old hunter slapped Ning Ke's head and scolded him with his eyes wide open, "Is the prey for you to eat? It's used to exchange for money and salt. If you think that I'm not treating you well, then get lost. When you catch a tiger for me and use its bones to pay for my meals all these years, I'll let you get lost. I've spent a lot of money to make a steel clip, but you're useless." Ning Ke retreated in silence. The old hunter finished his wine and left the house to check on the prey that Ning Ke had brought back today. After a while, he walked in angrily with a whip in his hand and lashed at Ning Ke's face. He scolded, "You wastrel! How many times have I taught you? Drag all the fellows back for me to slaughter. Who asked you to slaughter them outside?" Ning Ke's face was covered in blood, but he did not dodge. He knew that there was no point in dodging. He lowered his head and explained, "That rock goat is too heavy. If I don't kill it first, I won't be able to drag it back. Furthermore, I'm very careful with my attacks. It shouldn't be a problem to skin it. What's the use of you if you can't drag it back?" The old hunter lashed at him angrily and roared, "You only care about the skin. You've forgotten that blood can be sold for money too. You bastard! Bastard!" The old hunter walked out of the hunting house angrily. Ning Ke looked at Sangsang, who was hugging the bowl of porridge with her head lowered. He wiped the blood off his face and looked at her with a smile. "That's a good girl. Don't try to block the whip for me in the future. Otherwise, that old thing will whip even harder." Sangsang hugged the big bowl of porridge and nodded her head vigorously. "Damn girl! Hurry up and boil the bathwater." The old hunter's angry and resentful voice could be heard from outside the house. No one knew where his anger and resentment came from. Sangsang raised her head and looked at Ning Ke nervously. Ning Ke was secretly eating the meat that the old hunter had forgotten to hide. After a moment of silence, he nodded his head. Inside and outside the vast Min Mountain were two different worlds. The world outside the mountain had been in the Tang Empire for the 5th year of the Tianqi era. For the people living in the mountain, life was just a monotonous repetition. For the old hunter who took in Ning Ke and Sangsang, this monotonous repetition finally had some entertainment, such as whipping and cursing or something else. This year, Ning Ke was 10 years old and was already a teenager. This year, Sangsang was 5 years old. Sangsang poured hot water into the bucket. The steam rose up. The old hunter, who was naked in the wooden bucket, looked at her and scolded, "Damn girl, you're black and dirty. Hurry up and wash yourself." Sangsang nodded and walked out of the door. She took the basin of hot water from Ning Ke and walked back with difficulty. The hot water in the basin had just boiled and was very hot. Sangsang stood on the bench and poured water over the old hunter's body from head to toe. An extremely shrill scream sounded in the house. The old hunter ran out naked. His body was covered in blisters from the heat. He squinted his eyes, unable to see what was outside. He held a hunting knife that never left his body, and he waved it around like a madman. He cursed with the most vicious swear words he knew. With a loud bang, the two pieces of metal collided. The old hunter fell to the ground and let out an even more shrill scream. His right leg was in a steel trap used to hunt tigers. It was already broken in half. Ning Ke and Sangsang walked over and looked at the old hunter who was lying in a pool of blood. Even in such a situation, the old hunter still retained the ruthlessness of the mountain people. He stared at Ning Ke and scolded, "You bastard! You ungrateful thing! You will die a horrible death. Yes, we have taken revenge these few years. Now is the time for revenge. Ning Ke took out the hunting knife from behind him and looked at the old hunter's drooping flesh and the poor fellow at the base of his thigh that was covered in blood. He said, I wanted to endure for another 2 days, but you refused to give us the chance to. If you did not want to sell Sang Sang to the brothel, we would not have thought of killing you. If you did not want to take a bath, we would not have thought of killing you. Ning Ke looked at him and was silent for a long time before continuing. Actually just now, if you had been willing to let Sang Sang eat a piece of meat, perhaps we would not have killed you. We might have even sneaked away. The old hunter panted and looked at him in confusion. Ning Ke held the hunting knife in his hand tightly and slashed down. The old hunter's head fell off. A moment later, Ning Ke walked out of the hunting house with the boxwood bow and quiver on his back. The hunting knife at his waist swayed slightly. Little Sang Sang followed him with the big black umbrella in her arms. Get on my back if you are tired. Then the two disappeared into the vast Min Mountain. The night had arrived. The thick fog on the back mountain of the academy was as smooth and fine as milk. Ning Ke stood on the stone steps with his head down. After a long silence, he slowly raised his hands. He clenched his fists, as if he was holding an invisible knife. The night wind whistled on the mountain path. He tilted his body slightly and slashed down with his knife, cutting through the night and the mountain path. The knife fell and the stone steps went up another level. There was silence in the thick fog on the mountain top. A voice full of pity sounded, I wonder what kind of suffering Ning Ke has encountered in his life. I have never heard him talk about it in the old library. Why is this mountain path so difficult for him? The mountain path is long. The past trials in one's heart have all turned into reality and blocked the way of the climbers. If one can see through it or look down on it, it may be easier. But if one cannot see through it and has the intention to retreat, he will never have the hope of climbing the mountain. Second brother's voice sounded slowly. Until then, there was finally a solemn and respectful tone in his voice. The two people who climbed the mountain today are very interesting, especially Ning Quebec. Although he doesn't know what those memories and pain in the depths of his heart are, he is not willing to forget them at all. He doesn't have the slightest regret and even thinks it is unnecessary to see through them. Facing the darkest corners of his heart, facing the most painful experiences, the choice he made today is exactly the same as the choice he made in the past. If he can't see through it, how can he stay true to himself and not change after so many years? Since he doesn't want to see through it, he can only kill it. He wants to kill his way through this mountain path. For me personally, this chapter is very satisfying. It is about a murder case caused by a piece of meat. I have finally written it. Because it is so satisfying, I want to tell you a piece of good news. I decide to write more after dinner. There is one more chapter before 12:00 in the evening. As for the number of words, I can't guarantee. See you at night. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 157. He carried Sang Sang on his back and ran between the hunting villages, fighting with the beasts and hunters. He smelled the stench of the massacre in the Yen territory and saw Xiao Zhuozi leave with the cultivator. He took Sang Sang to the city of Wei, where he joined the army and became a soldier. He saw the beautiful and peaceful Shubi Lake. He and his comrades shouted and rushed forward. He saw the fierce horse gang running around like rabbits. The gold and silver they robbed became the trophies of the border army and were pushed back to the city of Wei. In the winter of that year, he went to the pigsty very early to listen to the desperate howls of the pigs. He saw the blood gushing out of the pigs' necks and excitedly blew the bamboo tube under the pig's skin under the guidance of his senior. He was busy all night. Looking at the big white pig being put into the boiling pot to be shaved, Ning Kai squatted on the ground and looked up at Sang Sang beside him. He asked, "Does it look like how we killed Grandpa?" Sang Sang said, "We killed the pig first and then scalded it. When we killed Grandpa, we scalded him first and then killed him." Ning Kai thought about it and felt that this was indeed a big difference. Before killing the old hunter and leaving the hunting house, he released the 2 lambs at Sang Sang's request. Ning Kai stood on the mountain path, in the night fog, standing in his own past years. On the long mountain path, every stone step represented a day that he had lived. Since he had climbed the mountain, it was as if he had experienced the first half of his life again. This was not an imaginary dream, but a very real reenactment. His life had always been filled with too much blood, rotting corpses, and death. What kind of feeling would it be to have all the joys and sorrows of the first 17 years gathered in one night? That kind of heavy mental impact was disorienting, and he often forgot that he was climbing a mountain. His expression became more and more painful, and his eyes stared at the distance in front of him. His steps on the stone steps became slower and slower. He stopped and his pupils gradually returned to normal. He looked into the night fog and said, "I'll kill for you to see." After saying this, he continued to walk up the next stone step. His right hand slowly reached into the air, into the white fog that was as fine as gauze, and grabbed a slender hilt out of thin air. Then, he pulled out the familiar long saber from nothingness and slashed at the nothingness in front of him. Before the blade, countless horse bandits were beheaded. Shubi Lake was once again dyed red. Countless barbarian spies were beheaded and fell off their horses. The autumn grass was stained with red frosting. Familiar or strange faces were chopped into 2 bloody halves and then disappeared. In the night fog, he killed all the way on the mountain road, from Min Mountain to the grassland, and then back to Chang'an. He killed the fat censor, the sword master in the lakeside house, and the old deputy general in the blacksmith shop. Everything that stood in his way was cut down by his saber, regardless of whether it was the enemies who had brought him painful memories, or the comrades who had once fought side by side with him in life and death but wanted to escape in the face of danger, or the warhorse that had brought him 800 miles into the grasslands and saved his life. Spring Breeze Pavilion was he killed silently. Lin 47th Street was raining. He saw the black-faced boy sitting in front of the gray wall. Ning Kai finally felt a little tired. He slowly put down the long knife in his hand and looked at the night fog at the end of the mountain path. He murmured, "It's not easy to live. It's painful enough to live for a lifetime. Why do I have to live again?" He looked down at Sang Sang beside him and frowned. He said painfully, "I know these are all illusions. Illusions can't scare me. But I can't prove that they are illusions. So I really feel very painful, just like we used to." Prince Long Qing calmly walked on the mountain path with his sleeves fluttering. He looked a little tired. From the moment he walked into the fog and stepped on the first stone step of the mountain path, he knew that everything he saw, heard, and felt was an illusion. He thought that he could see through all these with his clear Taoist heart and then climb the mountain easily. However, when he started walking, he realized that he had underestimated the difficulty of the second floor of the academy. No matter how bright his Taoist heart was under the refinement of West Hill Taoism, if one could not really see through it, then these illusions really existed. Prince Long Qing returned to his childhood. At that time, he was favored and could run freely in the imperial palace. The little prince always thought that his father was the most powerful man in the world and his mother was the most powerful woman in the world. However, one year, he accidentally eavesdropped on a conversation that directly tore apart all his beautiful image. That year, there was a sudden drought in the north of the mainland. From the wilderness to the north of Yan Kingdom and then to the north of the Tang Empire, countless starving people became homeless and chased after green leaves for food. On that day, the ambassador of the Tang Empire who was stationed in the Yen Kingdom was summoned to the palace and had a talk with his father. "Prince of Yen, I hope that the Yen Kingdom can show its ability. I don't expect your weak army to guard the border and prevent your starving people from running into the Tang Empire. I also don't expect you to be able to solve the problem of your people's hunger. But at least when the great Tang Empire starts the disaster relief, you should at least have a rough estimate of the number of starving people." The Tang Empire ambassador's beard was very long and it fluttered in the wind. It encouraged his anger or arrogance. "The food aid from the Tang Empire will arrive in capital Cheng in about 10 days. But if you don't want all the people in the north of Yen Kingdom to die, you'd better think of some ways. Don't expect the Tang Empire to solve all the problems. His Majesty cares about the world and sees all the people as the people of the Tang Empire. But the Yen Kingdom is after all not a part of the Tang Empire. We have no reason to give all the food that our people urgently need to the Yen Kingdom." After saying this, the envoy of the Tang Empire flicked his sleeves and left. Young Prince Longqing stared at his back in astonishment, only to realize that his father was not the most powerful man in the world. A random envoy of the Tang Empire dared to scold his father so rudely. He rushed out and asked in a childish voice, "Father, why didn't you send soldiers to kill that rebellious ambassador?" Hearing this, the Yen Emperor, who had always loved him, suddenly changed his expression. It was the first and only time in his life that he had given him a slap. Prince Longqing stood on the mountain road and thought of the 4 words on the stone outside the wooden door outside the fog. He sneered and said, "A gentleman doesn't fight? How can a gentleman not fight? Those who don't fight are all dead. How can he be a gentleman?" The mountain road was long, like a long life. If Prince Longqing's life was stripped of the golden coat of talent, it would be extremely boring and boring. It was unknown whether it was because of the slap bestowed upon him by Emperor Yen that day, or because he had been influenced by what he had seen and heard, but the little prince was no longer as mischievous and cute as he was in the past. Instead, he became quiet and hard-working, and he gradually learned that no matter what he saw, he would be able to remain calm and unaffected. His mother's 2-eyed cat had died after stealing a piece of pastry from the plate. Because of this, an entire palace of palace maids were beaten to death. He sat quietly in his mother's arms, listening to the sounds of the beating and the wails of pain coming from the courtyard. He reached out to grab a melon seed from the plate and carefully peeled it. He blew off the skin and sent it into his mouth, as if he didn't know that the pastry should have been his. Later on, more and more people died in the imperial palace. His older brother, the crown prince, had to change many batches of nannies and palace maids. He also didn't know how many of the lazy cats in the imperial palace died. His servant girl was killed, and other people's servant girl was killed by his mother. None of these things could cause his emotions to fluctuate, as if they had nothing to do with him. One day, Prince Longqing began to show his talent in cultivation and was regarded as a treasure by the West Hill Divine Palace's priest stationed in capital Cheng. He decided to bring him back to the Revelation Institute of West Hill to study. On his way back, he went to Yueluan Kingdom and South Jin Kingdom and saw many things. The lilies in Yueluan Palace were boiled to death. The gardener responsible for looking after the flowers was thrown into a boiling pot by the furious Aunt Cuny Matty. A follower of the sword sage of South Jin Kingdom, Liu Bai, was expelled from the sect. He was disemboweled on the street and his intestines flowed out. Prince Longqing looked at these things calmly. In his eyes, this was not indifference or cold-bloodedness. He just wanted to keep his Taoist heart clear enough, which was a necessary quality for the path to heaven. In the night fog, Prince Longqing looked at the approaching peak of the mountain. A sarcastic smile appeared on his face. He said proudly, "Except for Haotian, there is nothing in the world that can make me fear and respect. Nothing can make me feel pity. Since that is so, how can this mountain road stop me?" Prince Longqing walked slowly on the mountain path, slowly repeating his life. He went to the Revelation Institute. Because the divine priest who loved him had lost power in the internal strife of the divine hall, he became the target of oppression and was discriminated against in the first half of the year. However, he was able to be absolutely calm now that he had experienced the scenes that made him unable to suppress his anger. He remained calm when he was ridiculed and ridiculed. It was only during the competition of the Revelation Institute that he used death and failure to calmly return the humiliation to the other party. He entered the judicial department and began to hunt down the heretics. The thorny whip lashed on the young girl's smooth and delicate back, tearing open gashes that were too horrible to look at. He stood outside the prison and watched calmly, not making a sound. A student of the Revelation Institute was convicted of apostasy because he had spoken disrespectfully to the hierarch in private. He was sentenced to eternal confinement in the dark water dungeon. He personally pushed the student who had been close to him into the water. Then, he listened to the endless screams of apology and curses. He calmly walked out of the prison into the sunlight, his face expressionless. An old remnant of the devil's doctrine was finally captured by the judicial department of the Divine Hall after living in seclusion in the mountain village for 60 years. Prince Longqing personally tied him to a wooden platform. He carefully avoided the wounds on the old man's body caused by torture and then lit the firewood under the wooden platform. On the other side of the fire, a subordinate of the judicial department snatched a baby from the arms of a young mother and then stabbed the young man to death with a Taoist stick. Finally, the baby fell to the ground and became a puddle of meat. He quietly watched this scene without any change in his expression. The cultivation of Taoism was a way outside the world. He stood outside the world and looked at the things in the world. How could the things in the world disturb his heart? He worshipped Haotian and punished the sins of the world. He firmly believed that the people he killed deserved it. How could he have mercy? It was late at night. Many people who watched the opening ceremony of the second floor in the front yard of the academy had left. Although bigwigs such as the Prince of Tang, Princess Liu, and Priest Moli were still silently waiting for the final result, there were only 2 people left on the mountain road. They had nothing to do with many countries. Why should those envoys wait bitterly? Of course, the students of the academy did not leave. They silently looked at the mountain with a very complicated expression. Zhong Dajuan looked at Xie Chengyun, who was supported by Jin Wuxia, and saw the lost expression on his face. He sighed and said, "Chengyun, let's go back. There's nothing to see." Could Ning Ke really defeat Prince Longqing? Jin Wuxia worriedly looked at Xie Chengyun. She knew that although this man looked gentle, he was arrogant and conceited in his bones. Today, he gave up halfway and became insignificant compared with Prince Longqing. She was afraid that he had suffered a great mental blow. What she was more worried about was whether this man would be dispirited after finding that Ning Ke was much stronger than him. Xie Chengyun shook his head and looked at the back mountain of the academy which could not be seen clearly in the night. He said, "I want to see the result." Suddenly, someone made a suppressed exclamation. No one knew when the floating clouds in the night sky had dispersed, and the clouds and mist on the mountainside had also dispersed at that moment. For a moment, the starlight shone on the winding and steep mountain road, and even those stone steps were clearly illuminated. After an extremely short period of time, the clouds and mist in the mountain gathered once again, covering the mountain path tightly once more. It was no longer possible to see what was inside. But this moment was enough for many people to see the 2 figures on the long mountain road stone steps. One of them had reached the very top of the mountain road and was about to reach the top. Judging from the figure, it should be Prince Longqing. The figure behind him should be Ning Ke, but he was still climbing hard in the middle of the mountain road and was very far away from the top. Out of a very strange mentality, many students of the academy let out a relieved sigh. Someone murmured, "Fortunately, Ning Ke is still not as good as Prince Long Qing. Chang Xingming coldly glanced at that person and said, "Now I begin to doubt whether it is a mistake to study with you people instead of continuing to serve in the Yulin Royal Guards. Yes, we used to think that Ning Ke was useless and had problems with his character. But this doesn't mean that we should hope for his failure in order to lessen our humiliation." He said with an iron face, "Don't forget that Ning Ke is a Tang and a member of the Academy. Prince Long Qing is a Yen and a member of the West Hill. I feel very ashamed now, but you don't know shame, which makes me feel ashamed." The scene of the starlight illuminating the mountain road naturally did not escape the eyes of Priest Moli and the Academy instructors. Since Ning Ke began to climb the mountain, those who knew that he could not cultivate had not stopped talking and ridiculing him. When he surpassed one young cultivator after another on the mountain road, these discussions and ridicule became much smaller. When he finally succeeded in entering the mountain fog and became the only one who was still competing with Prince Long Qing on the mountain road, there was a long period of silence. From climbing the mountain during the day to the night, looking at the boy's speed, I'm afraid that he won't be able to reach the top in another half a month. Now that the prince is about to reach the top, why not directly announce that he has entered the second floor? Do you want us to continue to accompany him? For some unknown reason, Priest Moli, who was proud and calm because of his confidence, suddenly felt a little restless and irritated. He impatiently patted the back of the chair, stood up and said in a low voice. Li Yu did not even bother to look at him and said sarcastically, "If you can't wait, you can let Prince Long Qing directly fly to the top. As long as he reaches the top first, there is no need to care about Ning Quebec. But if Prince Long Qing doesn't reach the top, then no matter whether Ning Ke climbs or jumps, no matter how long he needs to climb, I think you'd better not say too many meaningless opinions." Priest Moli was furious, but he had no way to vent his anger, so he sat back in the chair heavily. On the meadow under the starlight, Sang Sang was squatting by the road with the big black umbrella in her hand, spinning the handle of the umbrella in boredom. At this moment, the young monk called Wu Dao walked out of the academy. His eyes suddenly lit up when he saw Sang Sang squatting on the side of the road. His body suddenly turned into a stone statue, unable to take another step. He just stared at her quietly until his eyes became infatuated and confused. After a long time, he looked at Sang Sang's slightly dark face and some fine yellow hair floating on her forehead. He put his palms together and praised her with the most gentle tone and the most sincere attitude, "Miss, you are really beautiful." Sang Sang stood up with the big black umbrella and looked around in confusion. After a long time, she was sure that the monk was praising her. She could not help raising her eyebrows and squinting her willowy eyes. She stared at him and said seriously, "Don't scold me." Wu Dao smiled and put his palms together. He said, "I have a discerning eye and can recognize jade in stone. Miss, you misunderstood me." Sang Sang heard the words, "jade in stone," and was slightly shy. Then she seriously reminded him, "Even if I am beautiful in your eyes, don't praise me like this in the future. Because this sentence is now used to scold people in Chang'an City." "Why?" Wu Dao asked in surprise. Sang Sang did not like his scorching eyes. She turned around to look at the academy and ignored him. Wu Dao turned to her and asked gently, "Miss, who are you waiting for?" "My young master." Wu Dao said seriously, "Miss, no one in the world is qualified to make a girl like you wait, except for me." Sang Sang looked at him and said, "You have already gone down the mountain, but my young master is still on the mountain. So you are not as good as him. I just don't want to enter the fog." Wu Dao explained seriously. Suddenly he thought of something and asked confusedly, "The young master you are waiting for is the academy student named Zhong Dajuan?" Sang Sang looked at him and said after a moment of silence, "Yes." Wu Dao said seriously, "Very good. When I was on the mountain, I said I would kill him. Now it seems that I have one more reason to kill him." Sang Sang turned around and ignored him. Miss, looking at your beautiful face as dark as the night, I suddenly thought of a love poem. Wu Dao stared at her profile and slowly recited, "The girl in my heart, if you are willing to cultivate Buddhism, I am willing to become a young man again and go to the mountain hanging in the sky to shave again, so that there will be more commandment scars on my head. The girl in my heart, if you are willing to cultivate Taoism, I am willing to become a young man again and go to the shabby temple behind the Peach Mountain to wash the shoes of the proud man who carries a wooden sword on his back." Sang Sang did not hear what he said at all. She looked at the back mountain of the academy in the dark seriously. At this moment, she seemed to feel the sorrow that Ning Ke was going through. She frowned slightly and looked very painful. "Miss, I can't wait with you anymore. I can't watch you wait in pain. I have decided to take you away. I will take you to the end of the world, to the corner of the sea. I will accompany you to the rise and fall of the tide. Is that okay?" After saying this, his expression became serious. He did not wait for Sang Sang's response. He opened his palm and reached out to her neck. His fingertips whistled with the wind. Although it did not hurt people's hearts, it could make people faint. Suddenly, the monk's sleeve on his outstretched arm burned fiercely and instantly burned into pieces of gray and black butterflies. Then they were blown away by the wind, leaving only a white and smooth arm. Wu Dao screamed and turned into a residual shadow. He retreated more than 100 feet and stared at the meadow with fear in his eyes. He gritted his teeth and asked, "Who is it?" A sudden sound of horse hooves broke the silence of the academy at night. The black horse carriage was very strange. There were all kinds of complicated patterns carved on the carriage. The horse pulled the carriage up the slope easily. There was no smoke or dust under its hooves, as if it was hanging in the air. Yen Sei, the divine talisman master of the Tang dynasty, with an indifferent expression, withdrew his hand that was previously stretched out of the window. However, the charm of the talisman drawn by his fingers in the air was still lingering. The green grass on the roadside became yellow and withered at a speed visible to the naked eye. "Lewd monk Wu Dao, if you dare to stay in the territory of the Tang Empire, don't blame me for cutting you into pieces with Jing Fu." Wu Dao guessed the identity of the person in the carriage. His expression instantly became serious. He put one palm in front of him and tried to defend himself. "I'm Wu Dao, the love monk, but not a lewd monk. Master Yen, are you going to use your seniority to pressure me? Since you come from the depths of the wilderness, how many cultivators in the world can use seniority to pressure you?" Divine Talisman Master Yen Sei slowly got off the carriage. He looked at the young monk indifferently and said, "But I guess you're just a useless thing. The temple didn't even tell you the rules. Remember, this is the Tang Empire. This is Chang'an. If you dare to make trouble at the gate of the academy, even if I kill you, the people in the temple won't dare to fart." After saying this, he looked at Sang Sang who was tightly holding the big black umbrella. He frowned and said, "Are you Ning Ke's handmaiden?" Sang Sang nodded. Yen Sei said, "Why are you waiting outside? Come in with me." Sang Sang replied, "I heard that they're not allowed." Yen Sei already knew that Ning Ke was still on the mountain road. He was extremely upset and nervous. He shouted in a low voice, "Come in with me. I'd like to see who will stop me in this shabby academy when the headmaster of academy and the eldest brother are not at home." Prince Long Qing walked out of the mountain fog. He looked up and saw a gentle forest around him. There was a rock abruptly appearing between heaven and earth in front of the mountain road. Reaching the top of that rock should be considered a success. He was about to continue when he suddenly felt something. He tidied up his clothes and turned around. He respectfully bowed to a big tree in the distance. Under the starlight, the top of the mountain was as bright as day. Clouds and mist kept flowing below like water. There was a man sitting under a large tree. Because he was too far away, he couldn't see his face clearly. He could only feel that he wasn't too old, but he was wearing an ancient robe and a tall ancient crown on his head. He looked very dignified. Prince Longqing did not know who that person was. But when he left the West Hill Divine Palace, the hierarch had reminded him that the students in the back of the mountain of the academy were not ordinary cultivators and should be treated with caution. The person under the tree was naturally distinguished since he could wait for climbers at the top of the mountain. The person under the tree said calmly, "I'm the second." Hearing this, Prince Longqing's expression did not change, but his heart was in turmoil. He thought of some legends that the woman had told him. He thought of the extremely proud and extremely powerful second brother in the legends. He respectfully bowed again, but this time it was a little lower than before. "You're very good." Second brother under the tree said indifferently, "You're definitely qualified to enter the back of the mountain of the academy." Even as proud as Prince Longqing was, he could not help but feel happy when he thought that the person who commented on him was second brother of the academy. "As long as you can climb up that big rock, you'll be successful. But there's still one of your peers in the fog. You can climb by yourself first or wait for him. It seems unfair to let you wait for him. But I can tell you that this big rock is very difficult to climb. It's more difficult than the mountain path you've walked. So you'd better take a rest first." Hearing that there was another peer in the fog, Prince Longqing slightly frowned. In his calculation, there should be no one who could persist to the top of the mountain today except for the monk. Those mediocre people could not even step on the fog path. Since it was inconvenient for the monk to enter the fog because of his identity, then who could actually keep up with his pace? Second brother under the tree said indifferently, "The choice is in your hands. You can climb first." After a moment of silence, Prince Longqing respectfully bowed again and then sat down cross-legged to show his attitude. On the mountain path in the fog, Ning Ke looked at Zhuo'er, who was sitting under the grey wall with his chest rising and falling slightly. He looked at his pale face and the aura of death in his eyes. After a long silence, Ning Ke said, "I can chop you, but why should I? We're brothers in this world. You're already dead. Why should you stand in my way? I'll go up and settle the rest of your things." Zhuo'er leaned against the grey wall and looked at Ning Ke with a bleak smile. His chest rose and fell more violently and he made a sound between his lips. "Fake, these are all fake. What do I need to prove that these are fake?" Ning Ke lowered his head and stood on the mountain path. He stood in the night fog and in the spring rain on Lin 47th Street. Suddenly, he raised his head and asked, "Where's Sang Sang?" Sang Sang stood beside him and looked up at him with her dark face. She asked, "Young master, what's the matter?" Ning Ke looked ahead and said, "Sang Sang, take out all the silver in the house. We'll find a good grave for Darky and make him a Nanmu coffin. He'll die in peace." Sang Sang said, "Okay, but young master, Master Darky is already dead. There's no way he can die in peace." Ning Ke said, "Anyway, he's alive again. Why not die again?" After saying this, he walked to the grey wall, raised his sword, and swung it down. He cut off Zal's head, cut off the rain-soaked grey wall, and cut off all the illusions, revealing the steep mountain path leading to the top of the mountain. Then he looked around and found that Sang Sang was no longer there. "I've said that these are all illusions. They can't scare me." Ning Ke looked at the real mountain path in front of him and said to the end of the night fog, as if to explain to them, "In my imagination, the Sang Sang in my memory is a perfect little handmaiden. But the real Sang Sang is definitely not like that. You can stimulate my own brain to create an environment of illusion, but you don't know that what is stored in my brain is not all real." A puzzled voice came from the fog. "Although I don't know what you were thinking just now, how can you tell that it's not Sang Sang?" "Because the real Sang Sang is kind, but she would never spend all the silver in the house for a dead man. Zhuo'er can't, she can't, and even I can't." Ning Ke smiled and lifted his sleeve to wipe the blood dripping down from the corner of his mouth. Then he walked up the mountain. The mountain top was shrouded in silver light. There were trees here and there, all of which were cold-resistant coniferous trees. They were not Chen Pipi's favorite jujube trees. Prince Longqing sat on the grass to regulate his breath and cultivate his psyche, his eyes tightly closed. A very small voice came from behind the green tree in the distance. "Senior brother, thank you." Second brother sat cross-legged in front of the green tree. His eyes were tranquil and his expression was solemn. He said indifferently, "This kind of harmless back door can be opened occasionally. Besides, Longqing is one step ahead of Ning Quebec. It's fair to let him wait for a while." As the famous saying of the Academy, rules depend on who has the strongest fist. Since it was the examination of the second floor of the Academy, the so-called fairness was actually just someone's own opinion. Prince Longqing went up the mountain earlier than Ning Ke, but he waited for a much longer time at the top of the mountain. The stars in the night sky gradually moved. Time passed by. After a long time, the thick fog under the mountain path flowed. Prince Longqing opened his eyes and looked down. As the night fog dispersed, Ning Ke, in ragged clothes, slowly walked out along the mountain path. His face was blue and purple, like a beggar who had been chased down the mountain by a fierce dog many times. He looked extremely embarrassed. Prince Longqing looked at his face and remembered who he was. He slowly stood up and slightly clenched his right hand in his sleeve. Ning Ke took out the pastry wrapped in a handkerchief from his arms. He stuffed it into his mouth to replenish his strength while walking to the top of the mountain. He did not forget to greet the person under the green tree. "Sorry, I'm late." Then he saw Prince Longqing and said with surprise, "Great, you're still here." Ning Ke handed the pastry to him and asked, "Do you want one?" Prince Longqing looked at the strangely crushed pastry in the handkerchief and did not know what to say. This chapter has 8,000 words. I'm really crazy. Even if it exceeds the time, I believe no one will care. Tomorrow will definitely not be like today. After reading this chapter, it will be a new day. If you have recommendation votes, please vote. Put your palms together and laugh. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 158. Prince Longqing remembered who Ning Ke was. He had lived a brilliant life and rarely had the opportunity to be humiliated. But last time in the Victory House, the academy student in front of him and his little handmaiden had humiliated him twice in a row. At least in his eyes, it was a humiliation, so he could not forget them. Because of his disgust, he asked his subordinates to investigate Ning Quebec. However, the result of the investigation disappointed him. This student from the academy was indeed a useless person who only knew how to talk. He could not cultivate and could not be his opponent. Since he was not qualified to be his opponent, he thought that there was no need to remember such a person. Before going up the stairs today, Prince Longqing had imagined what kind of competitors he might meet. For example, the young monk who obviously came from the unknown place, or the young swordsman from the South Jin Kingdom. He even thought that the academy might have hidden a backup, but he never thought that the person who broke out of the fog behind him was Ning Quebec. He looked at Ning Ke's face silently and smiled mysteriously. Ning Ke saw that he had no intention to eat the pastries, so he took back his hand and said with a smile, "Don't be too surprised, it's not an illusion." At this moment, 2 pieces of emerald green bamboo floated slowly under the starlight and floated in front of them as if they were alive. The voice of the academy's second brother sounded again from under the tree. The hard stone at the end of the mountain path is the top of the mountain. Whoever climbs up first can enter the second floor of the academy. But I have to remind you that the short stone steps are more difficult than all the tests you have experienced before. If you force yourself, it is very likely to cause irreversible damage to your body and spirit. Hold the 2 pieces of green bamboo in your hands. If you feel that you can't hold it, you can pinch it. Prince Longqing and Ning Ke bowed to the tree and reached out to take the green bamboo pieces from the air. Then they walked forward. They walked side by side. Prince Longqing did not show any expression on his face and did not speed up his pace. He let Ning Ke walk beside him while chewing the pastries, which meant that he admitted that he was qualified to walk side by side with him. Actually, I envy you very much. Ning Ke looked at the prince's perfect side profile and wiped the pastry crumbs on his hand onto his clothes. He shrugged and said, "You are born into a good family, have good talent, and have a good life. You also have a partner that everyone envies. For someone like me who comes from a terrible background, has terrible talent, and has an extremely bad fate, and only has a little charcoal head by my side, it's really too hard for me to reach your level." When the 2 walked to the bottom of the boulder and stood in front of 2 steep and narrow paths, Prince Longqing suddenly turned to look at him and said calmly, "You have surprised me a lot. If I had known this, I wouldn't have waited for you." After saying this, Prince Longqing did not hesitate at all. He lifted the front hem of his robe and stepped on the stone path. Ning Ke stared blankly at the entrance of the stone path, and his heart was in turmoil. As someone who had struggled at the bottom of life and death for many years, he knew very well that when a strong and proud person said such words, they would become truly terrifying. The last 2 climbers began to climb the huge boulder at the top of the academy's back mountain, and their figures suddenly disappeared. Under the big tree at the far end of the meadow, many figures suddenly appeared. They gathered together and pointed at the boulder and whispered to each other. There were men and women, some sitting and some standing, and there were exactly 12 of them. Some carried a 3-stringed zither on their backs, some had a chessboard under their armpits, some had an ancient flute placed in front of their knees, and some held a tightly wound embroidered cloth frame in one hand and a thin needle in the other. There was also a strong man standing behind a tree with a heavy iron hammer in his hand. When the others were discussing, the strong man was staring at the strange and tall ancient crown on second brother's head. His eyes were filled with eagerness to have a try. Chen Pipi walked out from behind the tree and was shocked by the strong man's eyes. He hurriedly stopped him and said, "Sixth brother, if you really hit him with the hammer, second brother's hat may be flattened, but your head is also very likely to be flattened." Second brother, who was sitting cross-legged under the tree, snorted coldly and slowly turned his head. Sixth brother put the iron hammer behind his back as fast as he could, and explained with a simple and honest smile, "Senior brother, you know, I feel itchy if I don't forge iron for a day. I can't stand it anymore after looking at it for a whole day. When I see the hat on your head, it's like seeing the iron ingot by the stove, and I always want to hammer it." This explanation was truly inexplicable and absurd to the extreme. However, second brother nodded, indicating that he accepted this explanation. He waved his hand and indifferently said, "We'll see the result soon." The female professor of the academy, Yu Lian, was also at the top of the mountain. She seemed to deliberately keep a distance from the other 11 people, and stood in a flower bed far behind the tree, quietly watching the discussion of her peers with a smile. The man with an ancient flute on his knee looked at the seemingly shaky giant stone on the cliff edge, but in fact, it had never trembled after thousands of years of wind and rain. He sighed with emotion and said, "Today, Prince Longqing is still the most powerful. The number 2 figure of the judicial department of the West Hill Divine Palace is really not to be underestimated. If nothing goes wrong, he may be our youngest brother." Hearing the words, "Judicial Department of the West Hill Divine Palace," everyone under the tree looked at Chen Pipi. Chen Pipi's chubby face showed a rare embarrassed expression. He waved his hand and explained, "I have never been to the Divine Hall. When I met Yi Hongyu, she had just entered the judicial department. But in my opinion, she must be much more powerful than Long Qing. The Tao addict, one of the 3 addicts in the world, is naturally extraordinary. Senior sister embroidery said with a smile. Second brother said with a serious expression, all the famous sects have extraordinary resources. Although their methods are nothing in our eyes, and they are like dust compared to the academy, they are enough to travel in the world. Everyone under the tree praised and agreed with him. But in their hearts, they were thinking that if it was eldest brother sitting under the tree today, he would definitely not make such a proud and narcissistic comment, and would only honestly comment on the merits and demerits of the West Hill Taoism. I didn't expect that the one who could catch up with Prince Long Qing and take the final exam with him would be Ning Quebec. Everyone under the tree looked at Chen Pipi again. Chen Pipi sighed helplessly and said, "Senior brothers and senior sisters, why are you looking at me again?" Senior sister embroidery said with a smile, "Isn't he your friend?" Chen Pipi touched his head and said confusedly, "I didn't expect that Ning Ke could walk to the top of the mountain. Based on my understanding of him, this guy can really bear hardships. His muscles and bones have been polished like a pervert, and he can really cultivate without eating. So the mountain road at the beginning should not have been able to stop him. Moreover, he has read books in the old library for a year, so it is possible for him to pass the wooden door. But even the mountain fog could not stop him. Even I feel that it is really inexplicable." Someone asked, "What state is he in now?" Chen Pipi answered, "The no doubt state." There was a light exclamation under the tree. The person who asked the question said unbelievably, "Prince Long Qing is already in the upper see-through state, and only 1 step away from the knowing destiny state. It is not surprising that he could walk to the bottom of the stone. But that guy is only in the no doubt state. How did he come up?" Second brother glanced at that person and reprimanded him in a low voice, "Nonsense. Of course he walked up." In fact, this sentence was really nonsense. But he was second brother. When the headmaster of the academy and eldest brother traveled to other countries, he was respected in the back of the mountain of the academy. Naturally, none of the younger brothers and sisters under the tree dared to point out this point bravely. Second brother slightly raised his eyebrows and unhappily reprimanded, "You have followed the teacher for so many years, but you still can't understand this kind of thing. How can there be a completely definite rule in the world? If all the rules are predestined, then why do we still cultivate and seek for it? If all the rules can't be changed, then why do we still eat and drink? Why not jump down from the other side of the cliff?" Everyone under the tree suddenly felt a sense of awe. They knew that senior brother was formally teaching them, so they listened attentively. "Although Ning Ke is only in the no doubt state, who told you that no doubt state can't reach the top of the mountain? If only people like Long Qing who have entered the upper see-through state and only 1 step away from the knowing destiny state can reach the top of the mountain and enter the 2nd floor, then why do we need to take the test?" Second brother indifferently said, "No doubt state can't climb the mountain. I have told you before that eldest senior brother stayed below the no doubt state for 17 years. He went up and down the mountain countless times. When did he roll down halfway?" Someone hesitated and said, "Senior brother, although what you said is right, isn't it too flattering to compare Ning Ke with eldest brother?" Second brother looked at the giant stone on the cliff and indifferently said, "If Ning Ke can succeed today, then he will be the second guy who can finish the whole journey of the back of the mountain under the no doubt state after eldest brother." Hearing this, there was silence around the big green tree on the top of the mountain. Only Chen Pipi's unreconciled words could be vaguely heard, "Eldest brother hasn't entered the no doubt state, but Ning Ke entered the no doubt state 3 months ago. This is a big difference. In fact, it is not bad to let Ning Ke be the youngest brother." Senior sister embroidery looked at Chen Pipi's chubby face like a big white steamed bun and said with a smile, "Although the feeling is not as good as Pipi's, he has dimples on his face and is really cute." Chen Pipi subconsciously shivered and hurriedly retreated behind second brother. He poked his head out and shouted, "Seventh sister, don't be too optimistic. This last test is not so easy to pass. I bet that Long Qing will climb up first." Senior sister Embroidery smiled and exposed his real thoughts. "If Long Qing really climbs up first, won't you be disappointed and cry?" Chen Pipi chuckled. "On the long mountain road, we first tested the willpower, then the power of comprehension, and the state. Then we tested the heart in the fog. Finally, we tested the stubborn rock. It's just a choice. It won't be too difficult for Long Qing or Ning Quebec," second brother slowly said, "because it is not difficult, it is a test of decisiveness after all. Long Qing has been soaking in the dirty water of the judicial department of the Divine Hall for many years, and he can kill women and children without changing his expression. Maybe he can make a choice faster." A gust of mountain wind blew, and the top of the big green tree rustled, the long grass gradually fell down, and the silver night clouds at the foot of the cliff were disturbed. Yu Lian, who was standing on the cliff in the distance, looked back at the sea of clouds and slightly frowned. Under the big green tree, second brother suddenly stood up, and his expression suddenly became extremely serious. He quietly looked at the giant stone on the cliff, and after a long silence, he murmured, "What a strong Haran sword style. Did the teacher change the last test? Why is it you again? You've already died twice and come back to life twice. Are you going to die a third time? I really don't understand why you always jump out of my mind. Do you want to remind me not to forget your villagers who were killed by Xiaofan? Or do you want to remind me not to forget how miserable your death was? Don't worry, I really haven't forgotten those things you left behind. But how can Xiaofan be so easy to kill? Hurry up and make way, I have to run faster than Prince Long Qing. When I enter the second floor of the academy and become the headmaster's favorite student, I will learn the most magical skills in the back of the mountain of the academy. You only need to send me a dream and I will kill whoever you want me to kill. Be good, hurry up and make way. Don't make way. You want to practice the knife skills for me, right? Then can you do it another time?" Ning Ke said as he walked to the grey wall in the rain. Looking at the dying friend under the wall with a strange smile on his face, he sighed helplessly, grabbed a knife from nothingness, and directly cut him and the wall into nothingness. Look, it's still the same trick. The people in the back of the mountain of the academy are also like this. Can't they do something new? He did not put the knife back into the sheath, but carried the long-handled padao on his shoulder and walked to the top of the giant stone. Anyway, he might continue to cut people later, such as his father and mother whom he had not seen for a long time, even in his dreams for a long time, or even that girl Sang Sang. Anyway, he had now confirmed that these were all fake, so there was no psychological barrier. Suddenly, his footsteps stopped. He looked at the two expressionless faces in front of him and said expressionlessly, "You finally came." Prince Long Qing was very afraid. Facing this kind of fear, he did not know how to choose. His most beloved woman had fallen under a cluster of flowering trees. Her eyes that were dripping with tears of blood were not looking at her most beloved begonia flowers, but staring at him in a daze. But he could not look at her, he had to look at her. Previously on the mountain path, he had thought proudly that there was no one or anything in this world that could make him feel afraid except for Haotian. However, at this moment, looking at the woman in front of him who was bathed in holy divine light, and looking at the bright red fluffy clothes beside her, he knew that he could not erase the fear he had for this woman from the bottom of his heart. The whole world was filled with holy divine light, and it was unusually bright. It was so bright that the woman's face could not be seen clearly. Only her fluffy red dress could be seen, and only her fluffy red sleeves could be seen, and only the bright red flowers on her temples could be seen. The woman was dressed in a red dress, very bright and cute, but also very scary. She smiled and said, "Long Qing, I heard that you want to enter the second floor of the academy. Do you think that you can defeat me if you enter the second floor of the academy? Prince Longqing bowed respectfully and said, I don't dare. More bloody tears flowed from the eyes of the flower addict Lu Chenjia, who was lying in the flowers behind him. You really don't dare? The woman who was bathed in divine light repeated indifferently. Prince Longqing slowly raised his head and looked directly at the pair of gem-like eyes in divine light. He was silent for a long time. Just as he was about to make the bravest decision in his life, he saw a silhouette. That silhouette belonged to a man. That man stood silently behind the woman, as if he would not speak for tens of thousands of years. Divine light swept past his cheeks, and a gem-like wind blew, as if Haotian was silently praising him. Prince Longqing stared at the wooden sword on the man's shoulder, and his body trembled uncontrollably. He made his decision without hesitation. He turned around and walked to the flower tree. He pulled out the sword from his waist and slowly stabbed it into the chest of his beloved woman. When the sword entered her chest inch by inch, Lu Chenjia quietly looked at her beloved man, as if she did not feel the slightest pain. Bloody tears no longer flowed from her eyes, and there was no resentment or hatred in her eyes. There was only calmness and pity. Prince Longqing slowly lowered his head and looked at his chest. He did not know when a transparent hole had appeared there. Of the two faces, one was extremely old, and the other was extremely young. Ning Ke looked at the old steward and then at his childhood playmate. After a long silence, he said, So I have to kill you all again. No wonder I always felt that something was wrong. Now I understand that it was because you all did not appear. He took down the long padao from his shoulder and held the hilt with both hands. However, he did not immediately swing it. This was because he realized that the place he was standing on had changed from the narrow stone steps on the giant stone to blackish yellow soil. On the wilderness, countless people looked up at the sky. The boundless darkness was spreading from the sky. People's faces were filled with despair and terror. The world was dark, and only a few rays of light shone from behind the clouds. Not everyone was looking up at the sky. At least, the old steward and his childhood playmate were not looking at the sky. Instead, they looked at him expressionlessly. No matter where he went, they followed silently, and their gazes always fell on his face. Ning Ke pointed to the sky and said to the old steward, When I had a dream last time, there seemed to be a door of light there. I don't know why I did not continue with that dream today. Is it because of you all? Then he looked down at his childhood playmate who was only half his height and said with a smile, Last time in that door of light, there was an especially huge, golden dragon head that stretched out. In fact, that scene was very stupid. It was like those turtles we saw under the Wanyan Tower when we were young. The only difference was that those 10,000 turtles put their heads together and became a dragon head. The old steward and his childhood playmate still did not have any expression on their faces. Since it is a dream, it is naturally fake. Since it is fake, it is not a story that has already happened. Since it is not a story, of course there is no continuity. A tall man appeared on the wilderness. His gray hair casually draped over his shoulders. This was not the first time Ning Ke had seen this tall man. He walked over, wanting to see what the other party looked like. The tall man did not seem to turn his body at all. However, no matter how hard Ning Ke tried, he could not see the other party's face. When he circled around the tall man, the old steward and his childhood playmate were still behind him, circling with him. This scene seemed a little funny, but also a little inexplicably sad. The tall man pointed to the darkness that was occupying the entire night sky and said, Look, it is really getting dark. Ning Ke looked up and said, I see it. The tall man pointed to the light behind the clouds and said, But there is still light there. Then between light and darkness, which side will you choose? Ning Ke answered without hesitation, Why should I choose? The tall man did not answer this question. He grabbed the wine bag from the drunkard beside him and drank it all. Then he took the pig's hind leg from the butcher's back and squatted on the ground to eat. From the side, one could see the oil dripping down his beard. Why do you want to kill your beloved woman? Because only by upholding the right path can one keep his Taoist heart. My words are the right path? Yes, because you represent the will of Haotian. Prince Longqing walked in the holy divine light and followed the woman in the red dress. In the past long years, he had followed her to kill many people. As those lives died, he became calmer and calmer. He was no longer as calm as he used to be, but he was calm from the bottom of his heart. The woman in the red dress in the divine light suddenly turned around and said calmly, "If Haotian said you should kill me, what would you choose?" Prince Longqing had a natural fear of her, and he was even more afraid of the man with the wooden sword who always stood silently behind her. However, after hearing these words, he only thought silently for a very short period of time, and then he raised the sword in his hand and stabbed. The tip of the sword pierced through the woman's body, and blood dripped down. The woman in the red dress looked at him with admiration and said, "Longqing, now your heart has really become very strong." Prince Longqing pointed to the transparent hole in his chest and said expressionlessly, "You see, I have no heart now." In the wilderness, the tall man asked Ning Ke with his back turned, "How did you choose before?" Ning Ke answered very seriously, "My body is in the darkness, but my heart is toward the light." The tall man laughed and swayed back and forth. He raised his sleeve to wipe the corner of his eyes and happily said, "I can't believe that after so many years, I can actually see a wild grass swaying in the wind on the wall." Ning Ke also laughed happily and said, "You see, I said it was not necessary to choose." The tall man gradually stopped laughing and looked at the rolling clouds in the sky. He suddenly asked, "But what if the sky falls?" "How can the sky fall?" "If? Then there will naturally be a tall person, such as you." "What if the tall person can't stop it?" "Then you can escape." "If the sky falls, where can you escape to?" "Aren't you just imagining what if?" "How can there be so many what if in the world?" "Since it's just imagining, just answer casually. What are you afraid of?" Ning Ke stared at the tall man's back. Although the tall man said he just wanted him to answer casually, he did not know why he felt that he could not answer casually. He looked at the sky that was getting darker and darker and suddenly felt extremely afraid. The temperature in the wilderness suddenly dropped, and his clothes were stained with a faint layer of frost. The tall man sighed and said, "How about we go back to the first choice? Without a heart, there would naturally be no fear." Prince Longqing replaced the position of the woman in the red dress. Bathed in the holy divine light, he walked the world with the great will of Haotian, driving away and destroying the darkness everywhere. One day, when he walked to the center of a desert made of gold gravel, the man who had stood silently behind the woman in the red dress for countless years finally appeared. The wooden sword behind him trembled slightly in the scorching gold wind. Prince Longqing looked at the man and said after a moment of silence, "From the moment I made the first choice, my fate was closely linked with Haotian. Even if you are the most powerful person in the world, you can't defeat Haotian." A gust of wind rolled up the gold gravel in the desert, and the wooden sword pierced through Prince Longqing's chest. Prince Longqing looked down at the transparent hole in his chest. The wooden sword that seemed to be able to pierce through everything in the world just passed through the hole in his chest without causing any damage to his body. A golden flower grew out of the transparent hole in Prince Longqing's chest and instantly melted the wooden sword. He raised his head and looked at the man's silhouette that was gradually fading in the gold wind. He said, "You see, this is our truth." After saying this, he turned around and left. The most feared enemies in his life had died one by one. Prince Longqing walked proudly on the desert made of gold gravel. Although he had lost his heart, he was still proud. He knew that from now on in the world of light of Haotian, he would be the most powerful and invincible person. All the darkness would avoid his light when it saw it. No, all the darkness must be torn apart and annihilated. No one knew how many years had passed, and all the darkness in the world had been annihilated by him. There were no more enemies around him, no more sins. There was only the purest light, the boundless light that shrouded the surroundings. At this time, the golden flower on his chest had become very large and almost covered his face. Even though he was in the Tianqi state, he felt that the weight was somewhat unbearable. However, he could no longer remove the golden flower. Suddenly, a distant voice sounded in the depths of his heart. He did not know who this voice belonged to, but he knew that what this voice said was true. Absolute light is absolute darkness. Prince Longqing was silent for a long time, and then he pressed his hand on the huge golden flower on his chest. In a flash, the huge golden flower rapidly shrank and turned into a golden sword. He roared in pain and struggled to pull the golden sword out of his chest. He looked around blankly. In a blur, he faintly saw several illusory faces floating in the sky. It was the man with the wooden sword on his back. It was the woman in the red dress. It was the beloved woman who fell under the flower tree. The three illusory faces looked at him indifferently, as if they wanted to see what choice he would make. There was light everywhere, and darkness everywhere. If he took a step forward, he would walk into the light and continue his killing. However, it was the light. Prince Longqing stood in the golden desert, trembling all over. His face twisted in pain, and his whole body was drenched in sweat. He looked down at his left hand, at the green bamboo piece that seemed like the source of life. All of a sudden, a lot of people disappeared from the wilderness. Ning Ke looked at the familiar face of the old steward in front of him, and then he squatted down to stare at the face of his childhood playmate. After staring for a long time, he suddenly raised his head and shouted at the tall man with dissatisfaction, "I still don't understand why I have to make a choice." The tall man said to him with his back facing him, "I said it was just a casual discussion. Why are you so serious?" Ning Ke stood up, and the frost on his body rustled down. He said, "I don't choose." The tall man replied, "Sometimes there are always things that are worth sacrificing. Sacrifice is a choice." Ning Ke shook his head and said, "I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I sacrifice myself?" The tall man asked in surprise, "Don't you have someone or something that you are willing to sacrifice for?" Ning Ke frowned and thought for a long time, and then replied hesitantly, "I don't think so." The tall man said, "But you made a choice a long time ago." Ning Ke looked at the old steward and his childhood playmate beside him and said, "That's sacrificing others. Sacrificing others is also a choice." Ning Ke admitted, "Yes." The tall man hung the remaining half of the pig's hind leg on the back of the butcher, and said, "Then you choose again." The night was still night. The temperature was still dropping little by little. Ning Ke looked at the approaching darkness in confusion, and then he suddenly looked back at the bright place behind the clouds, feeling the endless pressure coming from it. His body was occupied by an unprecedented fear, and the frost on his clothes gradually condensed into armor. He didn't know which direction he should choose. He stood alone between the heaven and the earth, looking so small. The old steward and his childhood playmate stood in front of him, and their eyes met through the transparent ice. He clenched the emerald green bamboo in his hand. In the front yard of the academy, everyone was silently waiting for the final result of climbing the mountain. At this moment, no one would use a sarcastic tone to talk about the academy student named Ning Ke, because he had proved himself with facts. The heavy sound of hooves broke the oppressive silence of the academy. Yen Sei walked down with Sang Sang expressionlessly. Those who knew his identity were suddenly shocked and stood up to greet him. The most powerful minister of offerings of the South School of Haotian had his own exclusive seat in the West Hill Divine Palace. His status was far above that of the deputy headmaster of the Revelation Institute, Mo Li. No one dared to slight him. The instructors and students of the academy soon knew the identity of this wretched old Taoist priest. They looked at the side in surprise and whispered. They didn't understand why this bigwig would suddenly come to the academy in the middle of the night, and at the critical moment of climbing the second floor. No one, including Prince Li Peiyan and Princess Li Yu, knew the purpose of Yan Sei's visit. Of course, Yan Sei would not be stupid enough to explain the reason to the crowd. After silently greeting those who were worthy of his greeting, he sat in the chair and closed his eyes to rest. His skinny palms brushed the back of the chair from time to time, showing a little bit of nervousness. Although everyone was curious about the reason of this high and mighty divine talisman master's visit, no one could ask since he did not say. After a short silence, someone began to whisper about the movement on the top of the mountain. Most people marveled at Ning Kei's hidden strength, but they still firmly believed that Prince Long Qing would be the final winner and successfully enter the second floor of the academy. As a divine talisman master, Yan Sei's state was so high that he could clearly hear the discussion no matter how low it was. Thinking that Ning Kei really wanted to enter the second floor, and even was only one step away from entering the second floor, the successor that he had been looking for half of his life would become a mirage, Yan Sei's mood could not help but be extremely bad. At this moment, Priest Moli said indifferently, "We, the West Hill, never think that a prince will lose to anyone. I know a little about Ning Quebec. He is indeed good at talking about heresy, but if he wants to enter the second floor." Yan Sei slammed the table heavily and shouted sternly, "That is absolutely impossible." Hearing this, everyone was shocked. They all thought that the South School of Haotian of the Tang Empire had always been at odds with the West Hill Divine Palace, and it could even be said that they were at odds with each other. Why would Yan Sei stand on the side of the West Hill Divine Palace tonight before such an important matter? After all, he was the senior brother of the nation master of the Tang Empire. Could it be that his statement had any important meaning? Yan Sei did not expect that his sincere words would cause so many people to speculate. He angrily pulled his beard under his chin and refused to express any more opinions. Li Peiyan looked at the old Taoist beside him and frowned. Could it be that my brother in the palace knew that Ning Kei had appeared in the opening of the second floor today, so he specially sent Yan Sei to express his attitude? At this moment, another horse carriage drove in, and the person who walked out of the carriage caused another round of discussion. Li Yu looked at the kind-looking chief eunuch and asked with a frown, "Old Lin, what are you doing here?" The deputy chief eunuch of the Tang Imperial Palace smiled humbly and said, "Your Highness, I am here on His Majesty's orders." Li Yu waved him forward and asked in a low voice, "What is going on?" Eunuch Lin lowered his eyes and said softly, "His Majesty wants to see someone, so he asked me to wait here." "Who does my father want to see?" Li Yu asked in surprise. Eunuch Lin smiled and said, "A student of the academy." After saying this, Eunuch Lin saw Yan Sei sitting beside him and his expression suddenly turned cold. He said, "Master Yan, why are you here?" Yan Sei glared at him and said, "Do I need to report to you where I am going?" Eunuch Lin said with a fake smile, "I am just a eunuch. How can I control where a divine talisman master goes? But His Majesty wants me to bring you a message." His Majesty said that the Imperial Preceptor had cheated him of a few hundred taels of silver at the Fragrance Workshop more than 10 years ago. Now, the Imperial Preceptor dares to hide the talent that His Majesty appreciates. His Majesty is waiting for an explanation from the South Gate. Hearing this, Yan Sei was stunned and fell into deep thought. He was shocked. Could it be that His Majesty also knew about Ning Kei's ability and wanted to steal his disciple from him? What should he do? Now that he might have to compete with the academy for Ning Kei's disciple, he was already in a difficult position. Did he have to compete with the Emperor of Tang? Younger brother said that he could do whatever he wanted, but did that include His Majesty? Everyone in the field intentionally or unintentionally looked at the two bigwigs who suddenly arrived. Yen Sei was the divine talisman master, but Eunuch Lin was His Majesty's most trusted chief eunuch. What did he mean by coming here with His Majesty's decree? Sang Sang followed Yen Sei into the academy. No one noticed her at all. She left the front yard and walked quietly along the alley between the buildings of the academy to the back. She walked through the wetland, the old academy with all the lights out, the dense forest, and the rarely visited meadow. She looked at the scenery of the academy and compared it with Ning Kei's usual narration. She felt calm and warm. Finally, she walked into the forest of swords. She held the smooth trunk, raised her head and squinted at the top of the forest with a few strings of sparse leaves hanging at a very high place. Then she chose a slightly clean place to sit down, holding the big black umbrella in her arms, and looked up at the top of the mountain. The clouds and mist between the mountains were still extremely thick, and it was impossible to see through the top of the mountain. But Sang Sang leaned against the trunk and held the big black umbrella quietly. She knew that her young master was at the top of the mountain and was going through the most critical test. All of a sudden, a gust of wind blew in from the outside of the sword forest, bringing with it countless grass and gravel, which hit the trunk and even lifted the hard bark. Sang Sang hid behind the tree in horror and opened the big black umbrella to cover her thin body. Outside the old and dirty big black umbrella, the wind was raging around the sword forest. The gravel hit the surface of the umbrella like arrows, making loud banging sounds. It was like the sound of war drums, stirring up one's emotions, but also extremely tragic. In the gust of wind, more than a dozen trees in the sword forest were uprooted and flew into the deep night sky with mud. Like a dozen awe-inspiring swords stabbing into the night sky. It splashed with jet-black blood. On the Wanyan Tower in Chang'an, Nation Master Li Qingshan looked at Monk Huang Yang and laughed. A monk came from the west today, Monk Huang Yang said with a smile. The enlightenment of the love monk doesn't make you so happy. You seem to be in a very good mood today. Can you tell me why? Li Qingshan stood up, flicked his sleeves and said with emotion, after tonight, there will be one more young genius in our South School of Haotian. More than 10 years later, there will be one more divine talisman master in our South School. Do you think it's worth being happy about? Monk Huang Yang put his palms together and sincerely praised, it's really delightful. Suddenly, Li Qingshan raised his eyebrows like a sword and walked quickly to the edge of the tower. Looking at the quiet night sky in the south, his right hand hanging outside his sleeve trembled and his fingertips kept flexing and stretching to calculate. Monk Huang Yang walked to his side and looked there in confusion. He said, why did the opening of the second floor make such a big noise? Li Qingshan's body suddenly became stiff and he said with a gloomy expression, we can't get it. Headmaster, it's really several floors high. The fierce wind that swept through the academy's sword forest was limited to a very small area and miraculously did not affect the surrounding environment. Except for second brother at the top of the mountain and divine talisman master Yen Sei in the front yard, only nation master Li Qingshan and Monk Huang Yang, who had entered the upper state of knowing destiny, could sense it. The common people in Chang'an city had no idea about it. At this time, it was deep in the night and most people had fallen asleep. A few bloodstains gradually appeared on the gray wall of Lin 47th Street. The sewage in the sewer of Spring Breeze Pavilion that had just been repaired suddenly had a blood-red luster. In the backyard of the lakeside house and the blacksmith shop in the eastern city, in the broken stone lion outside the former general's mansion and in the woodshed of Grand Secretary Zheng Jing's mansion, those bloodstains gradually appeared and then quickly disappeared. In front of the boundless pressure of light, Prince Long Qing crushed the emerald green bamboo and then looked up expressionlessly. He found that he was still standing on the top of the back mountain of the academy, standing under the giant rock by the cliff edge. He had never taken a step on the stone path. The night wind blew at his clothes, quickly dispersing the sweat. He was silent for a long time, then took a few steps back towards the lawn. Then, he raised his head again to look at the top of the boulder on the edge of the cliff. There was no trace of anyone there. In the cold wilderness, Ning Ke seemed to feel something. "You all know that this choice is not difficult for me," he said loudly to the tall man, to the steward in front of him and to his childhood playmate, to the light and darkness in the sky. When he spoke, the icicles hanging on his lips cracked and fell. He blinked and the transparent ice that blocked his sight cracked inch by inch. He raised his right hand and more frost armors fell off his clothes. Then he threw away the emerald green bamboo in his hand and held the long knife again, waving it down with force. After many years, he once again killed the old steward and his childhood playmate in front of him. "My umbrella is black. Her face is black. Ever since I was a child, everything I did was black. But it doesn't mean that I think I'm wrong. Since I'm not wrong, I don't need to admit it or atone for it." Ning Ke looked at the increasingly bright light behind the clouds and felt the increasingly powerful pressure. He said, "Even if you think I'm wrong, I don't care. Because what do your thoughts have to do with me?" He fiercely spat on his feet and carried the long knife on his shoulder. He resolutely walked toward the darkness on the other side of the wilderness. The tall man looked at his back and said nothing. Walking into the darkness was like walking into the starlight. Ning Ke stood on the giant rock by the cliff edge, standing at the highest point of the back mountain of the academy. He calmly looked at the scenery in front of him. The starlight from the stars in the night sky fell on the slowly flowing clouds under his feet, making the surroundings as bright as daytime. Although it was still late at night. He glanced at Prince Longqing who stood under the rock in the distance and said nothing. He turned back and continued to silently look at the 10,000-year-old starlight and cliff in front of him. The moment of starlight and flowing clouds were intoxicated in the mountain breeze of the spring night. Only by climbing to the top could one see such beautiful scenery. This world is flat. He looked up and saw the edge of the world under the stars. He could faintly see the peak of the mountain breaking through the clouds. He did not know whether it was Min Mountain or some other mountain. After 17 years of wandering and meeting each other in life and death, he finally came to this moment. How could he not think about it? In an instant, Ning Ke thought of many things in the past. He thought of the years that he had repeated on the mountain road. However, all these feelings finally gathered into the most sincere and simple sentence when he finally said it. Looking at the indescribable scenery, Ning Ke laughed. He laughed so hard that his body trembled. He laughed so hard that tears and snot flowed down his face. Then he wiped away his tears and snot and said seriously, "It's so damn beautiful. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 159. The people under the big green tree looked at the young man who was giggling at the top of the scenery on the edge of the giant rock. They were all touched and smiled silently. Only second brother was still sitting solemnly and meticulously. There was also a gray-haired old scholar who was reading an old book in his hand. It seemed that everything that happened around him had nothing to do with him. The melodious sound of a flute sounded. The man picked up the flute on his knees and played it with a smile. Then came the sound of a three-stringed zither. Seventh sister picked up an embroidery needle as thin as a cow's hair with her fingers and gently stroked it in the mountain wind. The tip of the needle trembled at a high speed and made a clear sound like that of a metal instrument. The strong man raised a heavy iron hammer and smashed it on the ground, making a loud bang. The hammer fell precisely on the point of excitement in the music. The sound of the flute, the zither, the needle, and the hammer mixed together to form a rather ancient song. It spread out from under the green tree and enveloped the cliff of the back peak of the academy. It urged the floating clouds to flow slowly among the cliffs and the pine trees to sway slightly, as if they were welcoming guests. Standing on the boulder, Ning Ke listened to the ancient song. He looked back at the big tree and saw those men and women with different appearances but gentle smiles. He looked at Chunpipi under the tree and knew that these people were the senior brothers and sisters of the second floor of the academy. They were expressing their welcome to him in this way. He could not help but feel warm in his heart. The warm feeling quickly turned into a burning sensation in his chest and abdomen. He blacked out and fell down. Prince Longqing stood silently on the lawn under the boulder, as if he had not heard the moving ancient song. His young face, which was like a peach blossom in spring, was still perfect. But his hair, which was slightly wet with sweat, was loose and messily draped over his shoulders. He raised his head and said, "Maybe it's a little ridiculous and lacking in demeanor. But I really don't accept it." Unknowingly, second brother stood up in the ancient song and came to the lawn. He looked at Prince Longqing's cheek and the two dim lights in his eyes. He said calmly, "If I were you, I wouldn't accept it either." After a moment of silence, Prince Longqing said, "If you can't see through the choice, who can?" Second brother looked at him and said with a faint pity, "You can't see through the choice. That means there is fear in your nature, whether it is about the choice or something else. Although I don't know what you've seen and experienced, I can roughly guess that Ning Ke is different from you. He has no fear in his nature, so he doesn't need to erase his heart as hard as you did." Prince Longqing stared at his eyes and asked with strong puzzlement, "Fear is human nature. As long as you are human, you will be afraid. Ning Ke is also a human. How can there be no fear in his nature?" Second brother was silent for a long time. It seemed that this question was indeed a little confusing. He shook his head and said, "Maybe this is the difference between a small fear and a big fear. Both of you can overcome the instinctive small fear, but when it comes to the big fear between life and death, between day and night, the situation is different." Prince Longqing understood what he meant. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "You mean Ning Ke has no faith?" Second brother answered, "Maybe so." Prince Longqing was startled, and then he gave a self-deprecating and sad smile. He murmured, "Because my faith is too strong, I lost to a person who puts himself first and has no faith at all. How can I accept this?" After a moment of silence, second brother said, "Maybe Ning Ke has faith. But the faith is hidden too deep in his heart. The illusion on the stone path can't be stimulated. Maybe even he himself doesn't know what his true faith is." At this time, Chunpipi carried the unconscious Ning Ke down from the giant rock, panting heavily. With every step he took, the fat on his cheeks would tremble slightly, like the ripples in a lake. He was very clear that Ning Ke had fainted because his spiritual world had suffered too much today, and his body had been severely exhausted. Moreover, he had succeeded in reaching the top and relaxed too suddenly, so he was not too worried, just like his senior brothers and senior sisters under the big green tree. Prince Longqing looked at Chunpipi's back and listened to the faint voice calling his younger brother to fetch water from under the tree. His pupils slightly shrank as he thought of the person that the hierarch lord and that woman had occasionally mentioned. He asked incredulously, "Is this him?" It seemed that second brother did not want to hide Chunpipi's identity. He nodded and said, "Yes." Prince Longqing looked at the fat lad who was ordered around and thought of the regret and anger of the hierarch lord and that woman in the red dress when they mentioned him. It was difficult for him to adapt to the contrast between the legend and the reality. The lad in the temple who was said by the hierarch lord to be more talented than that person was just an inconspicuous youngest brother on the second floor of the academy. Looking at the scene in front of him, he suddenly found that his experience today was not so gloomy and unacceptable. After a moment of silence, he sighed and said, "A real genius like him should be ordered around by you in the second floor of the academy. At first, I thought that I could shock the academy after climbing up the mountain. Now it seems that I am really stupid and arrogant. A real genius is a genius no matter where he is. Second brother followed his gaze to the tree and said, since he is a genius in the temple, he is certainly a genius in the back of the mountain of the academy. Although he is much worse than me. You don't have to be too disappointed. In fact, your performance today is very good. If Ning Ke is not more than you, I should be very happy to welcome you in the back of the mountain. Prince Long Qing sighed and bowed deeply to second brother. Then he turned around and walked down the mountain. The quietness in the front yard of the academy had long been replaced by a buzzing discussion like that of wild bees. Those high and mighty bigwigs still maintained their aloofness, but the ordinary officials, instructors, and students could no longer suppress the excitement and curiosity in their hearts. They eagerly awaited the final result of the ascent of the second floor, wanting to know who had won. The professor, who was responsible for presiding over the opening ceremony of the second floor of the academy, walked out slowly. The expression on his face was really a little strange. It seemed that he was very gratified and a little shocked. It seemed that he wanted to laugh, but also seemed to be worried about something. Today, few people, including the students of the academy, knew the identity of this professor. But today, this person presided over the whole day of climbing up the mountain. It was obvious that his identity was distinguished. After several inquiries, people finally knew that he was a divine talisman master who hid in the academy and cultivated in seclusion. At this time, seeing him appear in front of the stone steps, they suddenly stopped talking. Looking at the complicated expression on the professor's face, everyone's heart was stirred again. They had a feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. Huang He, what are you doing there? The only person in the field who dared to speak to the professor in this tone, dared to directly call out his name, and even deliberately added the word, could only be Tang Hao, the divine talisman master of South Heaven School, Yen Sei. Whether in terms of state, seniority, or age, he was above Professor Huang He. Moreover, he was a little anxious. Seeing this person dawdling, it was inevitable that his tone was a little stiff and impatient. Today, the result of the enrollment of the second floor of the academy has been announced. Professor Huang He did not want to argue with Yen Sei, the famous divine talisman master, so he looked at the crowd on the stone platform and said slowly. Suddenly, Yen Sei thought of a possibility. He suddenly stood up and stretched out his hand to stop him. Don't say it in a hurry. The drama that had been waiting for a day and a night was about to end. Finally, people could know the real appearance of the hero after taking off the silver mask. But it was interrupted by someone again. Even if people on the front yard of the academy were extremely in awe of Yen Sei's identity as a divine talisman master, they finally hissed. The law could not punish the masses. No matter how powerful a divine talisman master was, he could not kill all the hundreds of people on the field. Professor Huang He unceremoniously glared at Yen Sei. He thought to himself, you are the one urging me, but now you are telling me not to say it in a hurry. What are you trying to do? He asked helplessly, why? Yen Sei rushed up the stone steps and said righteously, the opening of the second floor of the academy is a big event. Although the headmaster of the academy is traveling in other countries and is not in the capital, you can't be so perfunctory. Before announcing the result, shouldn't you first take a bath and change your clothes, burn incense and worship heaven? The hissing under the stage suddenly became more violent. Even Princely Pei Yen and Li Yu could not help but look at the old Taoist priest. Listening to the noise under the stage, Yen Sei could not help but feel a little feverish even though his face was as wrinkled as the hard bark of an old tree. However, the thirst for a successor finally overcame his little sense of shame. He fiercely shouted to the audience, who dares to say that I am wrong, stand up and argue with me alone. The audience suddenly became silent. Whether it was Priest Moli or those professors and instructors of the academy who looked displeased, they all turned their faces away. They all thought in their hearts, duel with you, a senior divine talisman master who has cultivated to a high level? We are not crazy. Professor Huang he looked at him unhappily and said, Uncle Yen, what on earth do you want to do? There were very few divine talisman masters in the world. The seniority among them had nothing to do with their respective sects, but another set of simple and complicated system. Professor Huang he asked Yen Sei what on earth did he want to do. In fact, what Master Yen Sei was thinking at this time was very simple. If the result announced by the academy is that Ning Ke has successfully reached the top, and if this result is heard by everyone on the stone square and then spread to the world, won't it be a foregone conclusion? Then what else can my younger brother and I do to snatch him away? Ignoring the angry eyes of everyone on the academy's front yard, Yen Sei dragged Professor Huang He into a study room. Those who entered the study room with them were all bigwigs who were qualified to participate in this matter or had the power to change the final result. Priest Moli looked a little confused. He felt that he must have misheard something. So he cast an inquiring look at His Highness beside him. Li Peiyan also looked a little strange. He felt that he should not have misheard, so it could only be that Professor Huang had misread when announcing. In order to confirm his thoughts, he looked at his niece beside him. There was no expression on Li Yu's delicate face. Although she had guessed it countless times, and had even hoped for this result countless times during this long time of climbing the mountain today, when this result really appeared, it still caused a violent shock to her world, making it difficult for her to recover in a short period of time. Priest Moli's eyes slowly swept over the faces of those bigwigs, and the responses he got were the ones he did not want to see the most. He slowly stood up and looked at Professor Huang He with some confusion. He asked confusedly, You said that the person who reached the top was Ning Ke? Professor Huang He nodded slightly and said, It is indeed Ning Quebec. Priest Moli stood stiffly beside the chair and could not say a word for a long time. As the Deputy Dean of the Revelation Institute of the West Hill Divine Palace, he was ordered by the hierarch to lead a delegation to visit Chang'an of the Tang Empire. The main purpose was to fulfill the secret agreement between the two countries and send Prince Long Qing to the second floor of the academy. Priest Moli did not have a good impression of the academy. In his opinion, there was no need for a God's favored one like Prince Long Qing to study on the second floor of the academy. But since this was the arrangement of the Divine Hall, and the whole world now knew that Prince Long Qing was going to enter the second floor of the academy, then he must go because it represented the glory and dignity of the West Hill Divine Palace. However, who could have thought that after such a long wait, it was not Prince Long Qing who finally entered the second floor, but someone else. Thinking of the punishment that he might suffer under the wrath of the hierarch if this matter was spread back to the West Hill, and thinking of the hundreds of millions of followers of Haotian Taoism in the world who might waver in awe of the Divine Hall because of this matter, Moli felt as if he had been washed by ice water from head to toe, exuding a piercing chill from the inside out. He murmured, Impossible, impossible. Suddenly he raised his head and angrily waved at Professor Huang He to protest. How could an ordinary academy student defeat Prince Long Qing? The prince is only one step away from the knowing destiny state, and that student is nothing. The academy must have done something. If the people outside the study room who were still waiting for the result knew the result, they would probably have the same opinion as Priest Moli. After all, the one who competed with Prince Long Qing today was not Wang Jinglu, who was invincible below the knowing destiny state, but an ordinary academy student who no one knew could cultivate. How could such a person defeat Prince Long Qing? Could a vole defeat a goshawk? Could an ant defeat a lion? Could the embroidery lady defeat General Xiaofan? He said, Even if you think with your butt, how can that guy be stronger than Prince Long Qing? How could he reach the top of the mountain earlier than Prince Long Qing? The academy must have a problem. Professor Huang He's face darkened. He looked at him and said, Uncle Yen, we are familiar with each other, but we still need evidence. Yen Sei stared at him and said, the academy has evidence. It is said that you did not cheat. Hearing his unreasonable words, Huang He said angrily, Uncle Yen, are you going to act shamelessly again? So what? Yen Sei raised his wretched triangular eyes and shouted, anyway, the headmaster of the academy is not in Chang'an. Since the headmaster of the academy was not in Chang'an or the academy, as the minister of offerings of the south gate of Haotian, he had nothing to fear. As a sacred divine talisman master, he had no scruples in bringing this matter up. This shamelessly acted shamelessly. The bigwigs in the study room looked at Yen Sei's impassioned objection and were all stunned. Thinking of his previous statements on the stone platform, they could not help but wonder what had happened to the south gate of Haotian today that made them so strongly support the West Hill Divine Palace. Priest Moli looked at Yen Sei and felt strange. He thought that last year when this old Taoist returned to the Divine Hall, he had humiliated the head of the Revelation Institute and even quarreled with the great divine priest. But today he was so protective. Could it be that he cherished Prince Long Qing's talent? It was true that he cherished talent, but he did not expect that Master Yen Sei desperately opposed it and wanted to cherish the talent of someone else. Professor Huang He looked at Yen Sei coldly and said, Uncle Yen, although you have a high status and seniority, this is the academy's business after all. So it is useless for you to oppose it. Yen Sei angrily rebuked. The academy belongs to the world. Everyone in the world has a reason to raise doubts and opinions. The academy belongs to the Tang Empire. As a Tang citizen, I have the right to oppose it. You say it is useless to oppose it, but I still have to oppose it. Ning Ke cannot enter the second floor. It was unknown when Li Yu quietly walked out of the study room and came to the front yard of the academy. An official stood behind her. He had just learned the final result of today's mountaineering from Her Highness. He was shocked and tongue-tied. Then he remembered that he was the one who admonished Her Highness last year and thought that Ning Ke had no future. He could not help but feel regretful. After tonight, countless people will investigate Ning Ke's background. They will definitely find out that he escorted Her Highness back to the capital last year. In order to make up for the mistake he had made, the official began to think quickly. He disagreed and said, in any case, Ning Ke is relatively close to us. In this case, Her Highness should stay in the study room and ensure that he can really enter the second floor. Li Yu said lightly and sarcastically, those people inside are older than me and have seen more things than me. But they have forgotten some of the simplest things. The academy opened the second floor to recruit students for the headmaster of the academy. Ning Ke can reach the top first, which means the headmaster of the academy has chosen him as a student. In this case, it is meaningless for those people inside to quarrel for a long time and fiercely. She looked up at the mountain behind the academy and thought about how excited the lad must be at the top of the mountain at this time. She also thought of the return journey full of killings last spring and the past when she recruited Ning Ke but was rejected. She could not help but show some confusion and disappointment between her brows. She murmured, at that time, I thought that I valued him enough and had given enough sincerity. Now it seems that I finally understand why he rejected me at that time. After all, I can really see through him. The official looked at the expression on Her Highness's face and guessed what she was upset about. He softly comforted her and said, Her Highness treats his little handmaiden very well. I heard that he has a good relationship with her. In this way, no matter what happens, Ning Ke will always remember Her Highness's kindness. These are two different things. Li Yu frowned and shook her head. After a moment of silence, she suddenly said slowly, of course, now it can become one thing. People in the front yard of the academy pricked up their ears and wanted to hear what the bigwigs in the room were talking about. They wanted to know who was the first to reach the top of the mountain and who could enter the second floor of the academy. Many people noticed that Her Highness had left the room very early and stood quietly in a place not far away. They could not help but start to peep at the expression on her face, trying to guess the truth from her brows and eyes. Situilan, who was close to the princess, did not need to be so far away to observe the expression on her face. She walked directly in front of Li Yu and bowed respectfully. Then she looked at Li Yu anxiously and asked in a slightly trembling voice, "Her Highness, who won?" Li Yu looked in the direction of the study room and listened to the faint fierce quarrel coming from inside. Suddenly, her thin brows slightly raised and a rather elusive smile appeared on her face. She decided to cut the Gordian knot and settle this matter in advance. He won. It was just 3 simple words without mentioning the name of the winner, but Situilan naturally understood what Li Yu wanted to express. She raised her hand to cover her mouth to block the exclamation of disbelief, and her shining eyes were full of shock and joy. After all, the exclamation could not be covered by the palm. The girl's surprised cheers broke the tranquility of the academy at night. She jumped up excitedly and ran to the crowd with a smile. She held her companion's hand and shook it desperately. At this moment, without Situilan saying anything, everyone knew the final result. There was a dead silence on the stone platform. Zhong Dajuan's face was livid and he murmured in a trembling voice, how could it be him? Xie Qingyan's body slightly swayed and he gently let go of Jin Wuxia's support. He stubbornly stood up straight and looked at Situilan with a slightly pale face. He said in a hoarse voice, "You have always known that he was hiding his strength? So you have been waiting to see us make a fool of ourselves." Since the semester exam in the summer, Ning Ke had been ridiculed, excluded and ignored by the academy students. Only Situilan and Chu Yuxian treated him the same as before. Chu was the son of a rich and dissolute family and was originally different from the academy students. Needless to say, Situilan was born in a rich family and belonged to the same world as Xie Qingyun and others, but she had always taken care of Ning Quebec. Today, Xie Qingyun and the academy students were shocked and speechless. When they carefully recalled the scene that day, they naturally thought that Situilan had long known that Ning Ke had been hiding his strength. Situilan looked at the pale Xie Qingyun and the academy students who were as shocked as wood and sneered, "I don't know what kind of strength Ning Ke has hidden. I only know that if you had not been watching him make a fool of himself in the past 6 months, you would not have become the biggest joke in the world today." In the past, Ning Ke was a despicable guy in the eyes of the students and the biggest joke in the academy. However, watching him climb the mountain today, the students were extremely humiliated to find that this ridicule was actually so appropriate. It turned out that they were the biggest joke in the world. With a light clap, the remaining pastries in Chu Yuxian's hand all fell to the floor. He stared blankly at the mountain behind the academy and thought with ecstasy, "I actually know such a great guy. If my father knew it, would he still dare to say that I have made friends with scoundrels in the academy? Father, you have made a big mistake this time." There was a dead silence on the stone square. All the students fell into a deep feeling of shame. Some people lowered their heads that were usually proudly held high, and some even became a little numb and sluggish because of this mental shock. At this moment, an angry roar sounded from the study room. "Ning Ke's cultivation is so poor, how can we let him enter the second floor?" This roar barely woke Zhong Dajuan up from the huge mental shock. He seemed to catch the last sharp knife, raised his eyebrows and said quickly in a trembling voice, Listen, that is Master Yen Sei speaking. He said that Ning Ke's cultivation is poor and can't enter the second floor." "Master Yen Sei, that is Master Yen Sei. I heard that he is the legendary divine talisman master and the senior brother of the nation master of Tang. Even he thinks so, who can be sure that Ning Ke can enter the second floor?" Zhong Dajuan turned his head and stared at Situilan, saying in a trembling voice, "Did you hear that? It's not what you think." In the study room, Yen Sei roared with a livid face, "Did you see that? This is the token of the South School of Haotian. What I said today represents the attitude of the whole South School of Haotian. I think whether it is the West Hill Divine Palace or His Majesty, this little bit of respect must be given." Professor Huang he looked at him as if he was looking at an idiot. After a long silence, he frowned and asked, "Uncle, what do you want to do in the academy today? Can you put forward your request directly, and then we will see if we can discuss it?" "Well." Yen Sei quickly changed his expression and pointed at Huang He with a smile, saying, "This is what you said to discuss. If you can't discuss a satisfactory result later, I will not comply." Professor Huang He looked at the Divine Talisman Master, who was probably the most senior in Chang'an City, helplessly crying. He spread out his hands and said, "You first." Yen Sei coughed twice and said, "Speaking of the state, Ning Ke is far inferior to Prince Long Qing. But speaking of some unorthodox skills, he has some potential to be cultivated. So I think he is not suitable to enter the second floor of the academy. He is more suitable to be my disciple." He had said this as calmly and naturally as possible, but it still made the bigwigs in the study room suddenly change their expressions. Professor Huang He took a step forward with his eyes wide open, and Priest Moli even stood up in surprise. "You mean Ning Ke has the potential to become a Divine Talisman Master?" Professor Huang He stared at him and asked. Yen Sei looked at his expression and felt regretful. He secretly thought that he had endured for such a long time, but why did he fail at this critical moment? So he decided to throw caution to the wind and said with a cold snort, "Yes, so what? I chose him first." In this world, the successor of a Divine Talisman Master was as rare and precious as the phoenix feather in the legend. It was too important for both the Divine Talisman Master and the sect he belonged to. Hearing Yen Sei's confirmation, the bigwigs in the room could no longer keep calm. Priest Moli took a few steps forward and angrily stared at Yen Sei and said, "Uncle, since you have found a candidate with the potential to become a Divine Talisman Master, why didn't you inform the Divine Hall first?" "Nonsense. If I informed you first, would I have anything to eat?" Yen Sei stared at him and said. Now it was Professor Huang He's turn to smile. He looked at Yen Sei and said gratefully, "Uncle, do you think the academy will let Ning Ke go after knowing this?" Yen Sei suddenly changed his expression. He pointed at Huang He and angrily roared, "You shameless villain! If you didn't say we could negotiate, I wouldn't tell you this." Thinking that there was a new student on the second floor of the academy, and this new student might even grow up to be a Divine Talisman Master in the future, Professor Huang He was very pleased and proudly said, "Of course we can negotiate. If all the negotiations have a predetermined result, then there is no need to negotiate." Yen Sei angrily said, "You are shameless." Huang He smiled and said, "Learn from uncle." Yen Sei's beard and hair crazily spurted out. He angrily shouted, "I, Yen Sei, have found such a good talent in half of my life. Whoever dares to compete with me for this disciple, I will be irreconcilable with him. Even if I have to burn my body and break my bones, I will crush his bones and scatter his ashes." Huang He shook his head and laughed, "Uncle's words are so cruel. If I didn't have the whole academy behind me, perhaps I would really be afraid. I, Yen Sei, have spent half of my life. Ning Ke, good talent, disciple, can't coexist with me, crush his bones and scatter his ashes." The furious words of Divine Talisman Master Yen Sei went out of the study room like thunder and exploded on the stone floor of the academy. The smile that Zhong Dajuan had just squeezed out suddenly froze on his face, which looked extremely funny. If the fact that Ning Ke had successfully reached the top and entered the second floor of the academy was the first thunder in the hearts of the students of the academy, then at this time, a respected divine talisman master crazily shouted to accept Ning Ke as a disciple, which meant that Ning Ke might become a divine talisman master in the future, was like the second thunder in the hearts of the students. After the thunder, the students of the academy stood on the stone floor in a daze as if they had been struck by lightning, and did not know what to say at all. Chu Yuxian looked at the pale face of Zhong Dajuan and sighed sympathetically. If I were you, I would go to the kitchen to pick up a piece of sour stinky tofu overnight and kill myself. In this way, you won't waste the fresh tofu, and the taste is very compatible with your sour words. Please cast your monthly vote and recommendation vote. The latter is Sangsang's natal item, which will never give up. Thank you for your love to me, I will continue to work hard. This chapter is amended 201112010359. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to cast your recommendation vote and monthly vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 160. The divine talisman master Yen Sei was in a bad mood. He stared at Professor Huang He in front of him and said coldly, "Anyway, your academy can't accept Ning Quebec." Professor Huang He raised his eyebrows slightly and said mockingly, "Uncle, why can't our academy accept him?" Yen Sei roared, "That kid is born to cultivate divine talisman Taoism. Who else in the world is qualified to be his teacher except me?" Professor Huang He sneered and said, "Only divine talisman masters are qualified to be his teacher? Well, we can find 2 or 3 divine talisman masters even if we can't find other powerful figures in our academy." When he said this, his tone was as if he was talking about how he could always pull out 2 or 3 green radishes from his backyard. Divine talisman masters were indeed rare and honorable, but the academy was not an ordinary place after all. He was even a divine talisman master himself. The academy's foundation was so deep that no one could compete with it except the West Hill Divine Kingdom. Yen Sei suddenly became speechless and said shamelessly, "Anyway, I saw him first. Don't think about robbing him." Huang He sighed and said, "Uncle, you are a man of virtue and prestige. Don't always act shamelessly, okay?" Yen Sei spat and said angrily, "Look at me, your martial uncle, every day I go to the brothel and hug girls. Every pore of my body is filled with the word wretched and obscene. Where do you see me as virtuous and respectable? Even if you throw away your old face and feel inferior today, it's no use." Professor Huang He looked at him and said seriously, "His Majesty the Emperor and the Master of Nation may buy it. Even the hierarch and the great divine priest of the West Hill Divine Palace may buy it. But our academy will never buy it." The conversation in the study room seemed a little ridiculous. However, the dispute between 2 divine talisman masters, no matter how hooligan-like they were, was bound to be particularly tense because of their identities. The atmosphere in the room suddenly became oppressive. At this moment, Princely Peiyan suddenly said with a smile, "In fact, what's the point of arguing about this matter? In my opinion, since Ning Ke's cultivation is only in the no-doubt state, far inferior to Prince Longqing, then let Prince Longqing enter the second floor and let Master Yen Sei accept Ning Ke as a disciple. In this way, the Empire, the West Hill Divine Palace and Master Yen Sei will be satisfied, and Ning Ke will still be a student of the Academy's front yard. The Academy will have 2 students with great potential at the same time. Isn't this a perfect ending?" Professor Huang He was slightly stunned when he heard this. He felt that it made sense, but there was something wrong. Li Peiyan looked at him and said gently, "If the Academy is restricted by the system and can't make this decision, you can let Ning Ke withdraw himself. As long as he gives up the qualification to enter the second floor, who in the world dares to criticize the Academy?" Professor Huang He frowned and said, "Why should Ning Ke give up?" Li Peiyan did not answer his question immediately, but turned to Master Yen Sei and asked with a smile, "Master, I want to know, if Ning Ke becomes your disciple and enters the South School of Haotian Taoism to cultivate, how will you and the nation master treat him? Of course, we will treat him as a nephew and teach him everything we know. Yen Sei answered resolutely. Li Peiyan looked at Professor Huang He, smiled and spread out his hands, saying, we all know that the nation master doesn't have any outstanding disciple, and Master Yen Sei has no successor. If Ning Ke enters the South School of Haotian Taoism, as long as he attentively cultivates himself, and with the careful training of the two masters, he may be the future nation master of the Tang Empire. With such a bright future, why wouldn't he be willing? Professor Huang He finally understood where the previous question came from. He slightly clenched his hands in his sleeves and stared at the prince's eyes, thinking that the prince's move was really cruel. If Ning Ke was really tempted by the title of the future nation master of the Tang Empire and decided to withdraw from the second floor of the academy, what reason did the academy have to compete with the South School of Haotian Taoism for him? Previously, Yen Sei had been retreating in order to advance, and advancing in order to retreat. Now the wheel of fortune had turned, and it was the academy's turn to retreat in order to gain time to think about the response. Professor Huang He said firmly, no matter what Ning Ke's opinion is, we must consult all the instructors of the academy on this matter. Otherwise, it will be a trifling matter. In the early morning, Ning Ke woke up rubbing his eyes at the first glimmer of dawn. Glancing at the glimmer of light outside the window, he silently calculated and knew that he had not been in a coma for too long. He got up and walked to the table. He raised the pot of herbal tea and gulped it down. His spirit was suddenly refreshed. He looked around and found that this should be the residence of the academy. Walking to the door, he stretched out his hand and slowly pushed the wooden door open. The warm morning light penetrated through the narrow gap of the door and shone into his eyes, causing him to involuntarily squint his eyes. Suddenly, he came back to his senses and looked at the morning light. He stood at the door like a fool, unable to move. The long mountain path, the arduous process of climbing from noon to dusk and late at night, the repeated life fragments of joys and sorrows, the black wilderness and the strange dream all came back to his mind. I reached the top of the mountain. I entered the second floor. Ning Ke stared blankly at the morning light through the crack of the door. Only then did he realize what he had experienced and what he had done. For a moment, he could not help but be stunned. There was a perplexed smile on his face, as if he could not believe that all this had happened. Thinking of the last step of climbing the giant rock last night and the painful choice in the wilderness, he could not help but smile and shake his head. He wondered who had set up the illusion to make a secular boy like him make such a mysterious choice. It was like asking a butcher to think about philosophical problems. Even if he could come up with the right argument, who knew what the reasoning process was? He laughed to the sky and went out. Ning Ke pushed open the wooden door in front of him with a smile and walked into the beautiful morning light. Then he found several officials standing outside the door, and then he actually had to make a very difficult choice. You are not a student of the second floor of the academy yet, so you still have a chance to quit. You still have a chance to choose a completely different but equally wonderful and bright path. You are even destined to be famous all over the world. Prince Li Peiyan sat in the chair and slowly took a sip of the hot tea at hand, slightly reducing the tiredness caused by lack of sleep. Looking at the silent academy student in front of him, he continued, I think you should choose the second path, because this matter involves the harmonious relations between the imperial court and the West Hill. Although the Tang Empire is never afraid of any enemies and will never bow to external pressure, Prince Longqing entering the second floor is an agreement made by His Majesty and the Divine Hall. As long as you take the initiative to quit the competition of the second floor of the academy, the difficulties faced by many people will be easily solved. The empire will bear much less pressure, and all aspects will benefit from it. Li Peiyan found that Ning Ke remained silent and slightly lowered his head without any response. He was a little displeased and said, as a citizen of the Tang Empire, it is natural to share the burden of the empire. Of course, even I will feel that it is too absurd and rude to ask you to quit the second floor of the academy, not to mention you. So I will give you an absolutely sufficient reason. Li Peiyan slowly leaned forward and stared at the top of Ning Kei's head. He said, as a noble divine talisman master, Master Yen Sei did not hesitate to pretend to be a fool to take you back as his disciple. You can imagine how much he will value you in the future and how carefully he will train you. 10 years later, you will become a high and mighty divine talisman master, and you will become the hope of the South School of Haotian. The nation master Li Qingshan only has 2 disciples, both of whom are useless. He respects his senior brother very much, and he knows better than anyone else the significance of a divine talisman master to a sect. Ning Kei still remained silent, but his heart was stirred. He had just entered the second floor and won the favor of a divine talisman master. Just overnight, he, an ordinary and unknown student, a nobody who sold calligraphy in a shabby alley in the eastern city, had become a fragrant sesame cake that both the academy and the South School of Haotian wanted to fight for. He was even regarded as the hope of the South School of Haotian. Shouldn't the words, hope of the South School of Haotian, be exclusive to people like Prince Longqing? I know you have a good relationship with Her Highness. Li Peiyan looked at him and said gently, I can also give you a promise here. As long as you are willing to share the burden of the Imperial Court will never treat you badly. I also owe you a personal favor. In the future, when you enter the knowing destiny state and become a divine talisman master, you will naturally be the next nation master of Tang. Li Peiyan continued, the second floor of the academy is, of course, an extremely wonderful place. However, looking back at the history books, how many students of the second floor can leave their names behind? But if you become the nation master of Tang, there will still be countless people who will remember your name after thousands of years. The future nation master of Tang? Although Ning Kei's expression was as calm as usual, his emotions had long been shaken by these words. He seemed to see a brilliant golden road unfolding under his feet. Should he give up the second floor of the academy to learn from the divine talisman master and fight for the future of the nation master of Tang, or enter the second floor to learn exquisite cultivation methods from the headmaster of academy? This was really an extremely difficult choice. He even felt that the choice he made last night in the wilderness by the cliff was easier than this one. Ning Kei looked at the prince's face and knew that as long as he nodded, his future would be infinitely bright. He believed that these words were true. He believed that as long as he had the opportunity to learn from the divine talisman master, he could really become the nation master of Tang in the future. If it was not this man who said these words to him, he might really be very tempted. Li Peiyan looked at the emotional reaction in his eyes and vaguely guessed what he would choose. His face suddenly became serious and his right hand tightly grasped the handle of the chair. He stared at his eyes and said in a low voice, "This is the opportunity that Haotian asked the imperial court to give you. If you miss it, you will be punished by heaven." There was no doubt that this was a naked threat. In the face of such a threat, even if Ning Kei really became a student of the second floor of the academy, he had to seriously consider this threat. Because he lived in this world, then he would be bound by the rules of this world. Ning Kei bowed respectfully and said, "Your Highness, after all, I am a student of the academy. I have studied in the academy for a year and have deep feelings for you. I am willing to share the burden of the imperial court, but I have to consider the feelings of the academy." Some people unceremoniously put the power and pressure of choice on Ning Kei's shoulders to avoid angering the academy. However, Ning Kei was a person who seemed to be straightforward but was actually slippery. How could he take the initiative to take this kind of responsibility? With a light sentence, he directly threw the power and pressure of choice back to the prince. As for whether the academy would choose to give up on him and accept Prince Longqing into the second floor, Ning Kei was not worried. He and Liu had quite a tacit understanding on this matter. Before the headmaster of academy returned, no one in the academy dared to make decisions on their own. In fact, deep in his heart, there was actually another thought. If the academy could not even resist the pressure of the imperial court and finally gave him to the South School of Haotian Taoism, then why should he stay in such an academy? Who would not be willing to be a nation master of Tang? His and Liu's thoughts were not wrong. It was just that there were always some deviations between reality and ideas. Because they did not expect that the instructors of the academy also cherished Prince Long Qing's talent, and that the instructors were not all Tangs. In the early morning of the academy, the instructors were sitting in the room and arguing fiercely. Indeed, they could not reach the fastest conclusion because the headmaster of academy had not returned. However, it was precisely because the headmaster of academy was not in the academy that they had the courage to express their own views. Chao Jifeng, the associate professor of etiquette, said angrily, "Many people think that the academy cheated in this examination. I don't know whether this is true or not. I only know that Prince Long Qing came out of the fog very early. Then why did he stay outside the fog for such a long time? Why did he finally take the last step with Ning Ke? What on earth happened in the middle?" Professor Chao was a senior professor of the academy, so his words naturally had some power. Although everyone in the room knew that this professor from the Yen Kingdom raised an objection because he was not happy with Prince Long Qing's failure, no one could really explain his question. Some instructors even secretly thought that perhaps those in the back mountain had played some tricks in the examination. An old woman in a blue gown with a bamboo broom in her hand looked at the arguing crowd as if she was looking at an idiot. She said, "What a boring discussion. Whoever reaches the top first will be accepted. Such a simple question, why do you have to complicate it?" Chao Jifeng, you have been going to Chang'an to see your prince every day recently, and when you return to the academy, you cry bitterly, thinking that he is the hope of the Yen Kingdom's revival. But what does this have to do with the academy? I can't listen to it anymore, I'm leaving. The honorary female professor of mathematics of the academy left, and several professors who were dedicated to academic service and did not want to be bothered by mundane affairs also left one after another. However, the debate in the room became more and more intense. Many instructors thought that the imperial court's proposal could indeed satisfy all parties. In that case, why not make such a choice? Did they have to offend all the forces for Ning Ke? When Associate Professor Chao Jifeng was angry again and impassioned again, the door was suddenly pushed open with a squeak. All the instructors looked at the door in astonishment. After a moment, they saw a pink and tender little face poking in, with a pair of black eyes rolling. It was a little attendant who walked in. He was fresh and lovely with a little shyness. Looking at the instructors, he asked softly in a mosquito-like voice, "My young master has something to ask you, so he asked me to pass the message." The instructors in the room knew the identity of the little attendant, and asked gently, "What does Mr. Second want to ask?" "My young master got up this morning and found that there were still a lot of irrelevant people staying in the academy, so he lost his temper." The little attendant opened his eyes wide and looked at the people in the room, saying, "He wants to ask you why the notice hasn't been posted after one night? What are those irrelevant people still doing here? Do they want him to invite them to dinner?" Hearing this, the instructors looked at each other and did not know how to answer. They all knew that the second brother of the second floor of the academy was indeed a little silly, but they never thought that he would call people like the prince and Master Yen say irrelevant people. Professor Chao Jifeng glanced at the little attendant and said, "The candidates for the second floor have not been decided yet, so the notice naturally can't be posted." He thought that such a statement would make the other party unhappy, and was ready to explain to him. However, he did not expect that the little attendant was really too shy. After hearing an answer, he lowered his head and walked out of the door. The argument of the instructors in the room began to continue, but it did not take long before the door squeaked again. The little attendant's pink face was covered with drops of sweat, which showed that he had just run in a hurry. He looked at the instructors and said, "Young master asked, what do you mean by, the candidates for the second floor have not been decided yet?" Professor Chao Jifeng said unhappily, "What do you mean by, not decided yet?" Not decided yet means not decided yet. Ning Ke actually defeated Prince Long Qing and went up the mountain first. Many people have doubts about this matter, and they suspect that the back mountain cheated. If people are not convinced, how can they decide? The little attendant looked at him blankly, and after a long time, he suddenly came to his senses. He said yes and turned away. No one knew whether he had understood Associate Professor Chao Jifeng's words or not. The room was quiet, and the instructors did not argue again, because they strongly felt that the little attendant of the second brother would come back soon and continue to ask those stupid questions. The door squeaked open. The little attendant looked at Associate Professor Chao Jifeng with his big eyes and asked, "Young master asked, who is not convinced?" Professor Chao Jifeng was stunned. Looking at the little attendant's fresh and lovely pink face and his blank expression, he really could not tell a lie, nor did he want to push those people outside the academy to the front. He flicked his sleeves and frowned, saying, "I am not convinced." The little attendant was about to turn around and leave when he suddenly thought of the latter half of what the young master had said to him on the mountain. He quickly turned around, scratched his head and smiled embarrassedly, and asked, "May I ask who you are?" "I am Chao Jifeng." Associate Professor Chao Jifeng said unhappily, "Why do you ask this?" The little attendant showed a matter-of-fact expression and said, "Because young master wants to know who is not convinced." After saying this, the little attendant turned around and went out, running to the back mountain again. The door was squeaked open again. The little attendant panted and held the door frame, looking at Chao Jifeng and said, Young master said." Chao Jifeng could not help laughing. He shook his head and sighed, "What did your young master say?" The little attendant swallowed and looked at him very seriously, saying, "My young master said that the academy has never been divided by country, and accepts talents from all over the world. Chao Jifeng, you are from Yan Kingdom, so you are loyal to Long Qing. I don't blame you, but you have to remember that you are a professor of etiquette. How did you teach the first class to the students of the academy? What is the etiquette of the academy?" The little attendant's pink face raised his eyebrows from time to time, showing indifference and displeasure. He was obviously imitating the expression of the second brother of the academy when he spoke, which looked very funny and cute, causing a burst of laughter from the instructors in the room. However, Chao Jifeng could not laugh. The smile on his face instantly disappeared, and he suppressed his anger and asked, "What does Mr. Second want to say?" "Chao Jifeng, you said in the study room that the etiquette of the academy is the rule, and the rule depends on who has the power to make the rules." The little attendant looked at him and said seriously, "The headmaster of the academy and eldest brother are traveling in other countries, so in the current academy, I am the only one who has the power to make the rules. So no matter whether you are convinced or not, you must be convinced. Post the notice immediately." Chao Jifeng was stunned for a while, and then he angrily waved his academy robe and protested, "How can such a domineering behavior convince the public?" The little attendant did not know that this was a true expression, and thought it was also a formal question. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly raised his little hand happily, applauded and said happily, "Young master is really smart. He even guessed this sentence of yours. He asked me to tell you." The expression on Chao Jifeng's face was very ugly. The little attendant looked at him, pretended to be serious, and said, "I don't need to convince the public, I just need to obey." An instructor could not bear to see Professor Chao's embarrassed expression at this time, and said, "Even if we don't care about the views of His Majesty, Master Yen Sei or the West Hill, we should always respect Ning Ke's own choice." When the wooden door was pushed open again, the little attendant's clothes were all wet with sweat. He raised his sleeves to wipe the sweat on his forehead, and it took a long time for him to calm down. He looked up at the people in the room and relayed second brother's conclusion for the last time. Respect Ning Kei's own choice? Why should I respect him? As for the nation master of Tang. At this point, the little attendant deliberately paused for a long time. Then he raised his slightly pointed chin, rolled his eyes at the roof, and snorted clumsily from his little nose. He imitated the expression of the arrogant man on the mountain, making him look very cute. Is it very great? On a flat cliff in the back mountain of the academy, green pines were angrily spreading to welcome guests, and white clouds were flowing among them, like a fairyland on earth. There were two people standing on the edge of the cliff. One of them was wearing a very dirty and tattered Taoist robe. The other one was wearing a very strange ancient crown. Second brother of the academy turned around, looked at Yen Sei, the minister of offerings of the South School of Haotian expressionlessly, and said, "How dare you reach out to the academy, and even want to steal my teacher's student? Not to mention you, even the Haotian hierarch of West Hill doesn't have this weight." Yen Sei smiled strangely, looked at him and said, "The second brother of the academy is really the proudest second brother in the world, and your words are really unpleasant. But I am older than you, so I won't fight with you, lest people say that I bully the younger generation. But I must take Ning Kei away. Even if the headmaster of academy is here, I will still have this attitude. If you want me to die, I have to do it." Second brother looked at him with a slightly mocking smile, and said, "Don't make so many excuses. If you are not senile, you should remember that my seniority is higher than yours, no matter from the teacher or Pippi. Since you want to steal Ning Kei from me, how can we not fight? I said I won't fight, so I won't fight." Yen Sei looked at the crown on his head, and said sarcastically, "The back of the mountain of the academy is your home field, and I am not so stupid. Anyway, if I don't fight, you can't fight with me. As for Ning Kei, it depends on his attitude. In the future, my younger brother and I will make sure that he will become the nation master of Tang, which is better than staying in this mountain every day and being bullied by your senior brothers." Second brother rolled his eyes and said sarcastically, "The nation master of Tang is so great? Isn't he still bullied by the Li family and those old fakes in West Hill every day? The nation master of Tang is not a nation master, but a little wife who is bullied but does not dare to cry. Oh, this little boy is so cute. It reminds me of my childhood. Why was I so dull and boring? Study hard and make progress every day. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 161. Yen Sei was so angry that his whole body trembled. However, before he had time to react, he heard another sentence coming from the cliff edge. "Oh, I was wrong. Li Qingshan, and you still dare to cry. Only children who can cry have milk. Now your problem is that you don't know whether to throw yourself at the left or the right." Yen Sei was stunned by this sentence, and his anger was forced to be sublimated into embarrassment. He said angrily, "How vulgar the words are." Second brother turned around, looked at him calmly and said, "Sh*T is also the way. As long as it makes sense, you don't need to care about the words." Yen Sei shook his head again and again. Looking at Fang Zheng, who looked solemn, he sighed and said, Jun Mo, how do you want the world to see you? I really don't understand how a proud and stupid person like you can live for so many years." Second brother smiled slightly and stood on the cliff edge with his hands clasped behind his back. He said, "I rarely go down the mountain, and I won't provoke those few people I can't afford to offend. Those few people who can afford to offend me don't dare to go up the mountain to provoke me. Naturally, I can live well. As for you, you are never in the list of people I can't afford to offend. Except that you have lived decades longer than me, how can you be stronger than me in terms of ability, state and seniority? So, in front of you, what can I do even if I am a little proud? Don't you know how to respect the elderly and the wise? Yen Sei angrily flicked his sleeves. If living longer is worthy of respect, then when I was born as a baby, wouldn't I have to bow and kowtow to every person I saw? It does make some sense to respect the wise, but Yen Sei, how can you be called a wise man? Second brother turned around and looked at the old face of the divine talisman master with some contempt and disappointment. He said coldly, if you hadn't been stupid enough to take the pure yang oath to enter the Tao of calligraphy, how could you still stay at the upper state of knowing destiny and not be able to take that step? The content of this sentence, especially second brother's tone of pity and sorrow as an elder, directly poked Master Yen Sei's sore spot. He waved his sleeves wildly and shouted, I haven't crossed that step, but can you? Second brother looked up at the sky and said with a sneer, you're old and weak. You don't have many years to waste. But I'm different. In recent years, I've often been touched by something. I know that if I can find an opportunity, I'll definitely be able to take that step. Yen Sei was slightly stunned. He suddenly thought of something and mocked, rumor has it that Liu Bai of the South Jin Kingdom's first step had already stepped on the turbid waves of the Yellow River. I wonder if your feet have ever touched the clouds? Hearing the words Liu Bai of the South Jin Kingdom, second brother's expression changed slightly. There was not a trace of vigilance or resentment in his eyes. Instead, he was excited and said, Yu Sheng is also a genius and is a disciple of the headmaster. If he can't take that step before Liu Bai, wouldn't he be ashamed to death? Hearing this answer, Yen Sei was stunned and speechless. He thought that even Liu Bai, the most powerful man in the world, could not destroy this person's pride and confidence. After a moment of silence, he tentatively asked, how about Yi Su? Second brother frowned slightly and showed a look of disgust, as if saying that it was ridiculous for Yen Sei to compare him with that loser. Yen Sei gasped and thought that second brother even looked down on the world wayfarers in the abbey. Then he continued to ask, what do you think of the other two? Looking at the divine talisman master's face, second brother felt that the questions he asked were getting more and more stupid. He didn't bother to answer and directly said, let's cut the crap. Do you want a successor or do you want a divine talisman master in the South School? Master Yen Sei was puzzled and asked, what's the difference? Second brother was silent and let him think by himself. Yen Sei suddenly understood the hidden meaning in his words. Without hesitation, he resolutely said, of course I want both. Second brother tilted his head and looked at him quietly. After a long time, he said, you really take it for granted. Yen Sei frowned and said, what do you mean by take it for granted? Second brother shook his head and said with emotion, take it for granted. That means you are dreaming. Yen Sei was speechless. Second brother looked at him and said, I have already made a concession. If you insist on taking 2 steps forward, then we might as well fall off this cliff together. At that time, we'll see whether you survive or I survive. If I survive, we'll forget about it. If I die, you can do whatever you want. I think this proposal is more concise and powerful. What do you think? Yen Sei said grumpily, I'm a talisman Taoism practitioner. If you don't let me fall down and become a meat pie, then you can open the inhibition formation in the mountain to save your life. How could you say such a vicious idea? Why do you hesitate for such a long time for such a simple choice? Second brother waved his hand and said, in my opinion, of course, it's more important to have a successor. Otherwise, when you die at the end of your life, there will be no one to send you off. Isn't it a pity that all your talisman Taoism skills will turn into mud and dust together with your body? As for the South School of Haotian, as long as the Tang Empire doesn't perish, as long as those old farts from West Hill still want to preach in the Tang Empire, they can naturally last for thousands of years. How can they lack a divine talisman master? He looked at Yen Sei and continued, I can make the decision for the academy. After Ning Ke enters the second floor, as long as you don't force him to join the Haotian Taoism, he can learn some talisman Taoism from you when he's free. Yen Sei said angrily, how can the wonderful talisman Taoism become talisman Taoism in your mouth? Jun Mo, don't bully me too much. It's okay if the headmaster of academy said so. But you're just a student of the academy, where did you? Before he finished his words, second brother stared at him and waved his hand to stop him. He said, do you want it or not? Say it quickly. If it weren't for the fact that you first discovered Ning Ke's potential, do you really think that there aren't many divine talisman masters in the academy? In the end, any argument or quarrel relied not on words, but on physical strength. Such a simple sentence reflected the unparalleled confidence of the academy in the world. Yen Sei suddenly turned into the autumn leaves, dejected and colorless. After struggling for a long time or a short time, Yen Sei finally made a difficult decision. He looked at the white clouds under the cliff and the magnificent city of Chang, and in the distance, and sighed silently in his heart, younger brother, I'm sorry. In a room of the academy, Prince Li Peiyan of the Tang Empire was still educating Ning Quebec. However, no matter how he inculcated Ning Ke with the righteousness of the country and the interests of the people, Ning Ke, who stood in front of him, was always willing to answer one sentence. Ning Ke looked at Li Peiyan with a sincere smile on his face, and answered in a very sincere tone, I'm a student of the academy, and I'll listen to the academy. The smile on Li Peiyan's face gradually faded, and he looked at him coldly and indifferently said, very good. Ning Ke seemed not to notice the emotional changes of this bigwig, and replied politely with a slight bow, Your Highness, you flatter me. Li Peiyan pushed the door angrily, thinking that if Ning Ke really entered the second floor, how would Prince Long Qing deal with it? If Brother Long Qing knew the news, would he blame him for not doing a good job? How would the imperial court explain it to the West Hill? Thinking of these questions, his expression naturally did not look good. He coldly glanced at the official beside him, and asked with the last hope, how did the academy reply? I believe they won't have other ideas about such a beneficial thing, right? The official replied with a bitter smile, Your Highness, the notice has been posted, and the academy has confirmed that Ning Ke can enter the second floor. I've previously asked for the reason, and Professor Huang he said that it was the decision of the second floor, and they didn't need to tell us the reason. Li Peiyan was slightly startled, and then immediately became furious. However, although he was a prince of the Tang Empire, he had no influence on the academy, especially the second floor at the back of the mountain, which had a special status. No matter how angry he cursed, it would only expose his own shortcomings. Almost in a flash, he transferred all his anger to Ning Ke in the room. He did not know when, but Eunuch Lin came to his side, and kindly reminded him, Your Highness, in my opinion, His Majesty is actually not concerned about how to explain it to the West Hill. As for Ning Ke, perhaps you'd better not pay attention to him. After confirming that the prince and the officials of the imperial court had left the academy, Ning Ke walked out of the room. He walked along the garden's roofed corridor for a few turns, and suddenly saw a chubby figure standing under the willow tree. Ning Ke walked forward, and very seriously bowed to the ground, saying, Thank you. Chen Pipi very seriously said, Since you're thanking me, you should be more practical. Ning Ke thought for a moment, and said, I'll invite you to my house for dinner in a few days. I'll ask Sang Sang to make hot and sour noodle slice soup for you, and I'll tell you that her cooking skills are no worse than those in the eastern city. I usually don't tell others this secret. Chen Pipi did not reply, but looked at him and suddenly said, From today on, we're senior brothers. Ning Ke looked at his round face, and although he was somewhat unwilling, he had to bow again after a sigh, and said, "Senior brother." Chen Pipi smiled, and did not stop him at all. He looked at Ning Ke's head and said proudly, "Junior brother, you don't have to be so polite." Ning Ke looked up, and the two looked at each other and smiled. After a whole year of acquaintance in the old library, a loser who could not cultivate finally became a member of the second floor of the academy. Whether it was Ning Ke himself or Chen Pipi who saw this miracle happen with their own eyes, they all sighed with emotion. Chen Pipi said with emotion, "Teacher once said that there is a kind of cicada in the arid land of the far west. It hides in the mud for 23 years, and only wakes up when the snow mountain melts and the flood comes. It takes a bath in the mud, dries its wings in the cold wind, and finally flies into the void." Ning Ke smiled and shook his head, saying, "You and I don't need to talk like this. Do you want me to flatter you again?" Chen Pipi said, "This description is not exaggerated. You're a loser who has no acupoints connected, but suddenly jumped into the blue cloud. What's more shocking is that you have the potential to be a divine talisman master, and even alarmed Master Yen Sei of the South School of Haotian." In fact, until now, Ning Ke did not know what was going on. He had never seen Master Yen Sei, and only knew from others that he was a very great divine talisman master, and was the senior brother of the nation master. But why did he choose him? Coming to the familiar environment, beside the familiar wetland, Ning Ke saw the most familiar thin figure. He walked up, looked at Sang Sang's tired face, and looked at the grass and leaves in her yellowish hair. He reached out to pick them up carefully, and said gently, "You've been waiting for me for such a long time. You've worked hard." Sang Sang looked up at him and said seriously, "Young master, you've really worked hard." After a whole night of mental and physical suffering, and being shocked by the ecstasy of the final success, Ning Ke directly fainted on the top of the mountain. At this time, although he had rested for a while, he still felt a little confused in his mind. Sang Sang did not tell him, but last night she hid under the black umbrella alone like a wounded little beast, avoiding the hurricane that came out of nowhere and raged through the sword forest. She was also very tired, panicked, and weak. The master and the handmaiden supported each other, and walked slowly and painstakingly along the wetland in the morning light towards the plain. The front yard of the academy was much quieter than last night. The officials and envoys had already left, and most of the students of the academy stayed. They gathered under the notice and looked up at the familiar and strange name that they had deliberately forgotten for half a year, but today it was forced back to them in such a cruel way. They were shocked and speechless. The students didn't leave even after knowing the final results of the second-floor exam. Subconsciously, they wanted to see Ning Ke walk in front of them. Only then would they be able to prove that all of this was not an illusion. However, this subconscious thought was a little too masochistic. The morning light was no longer bright, and gently shone on the academy at the foot of the mountain together with the spring breeze. Two figures, one big and one small, slowly walked out from the back of the academy, and everyone subconsciously looked at them. After a night of climbing and rolling on the mountain road, Ning Ke's academy spring clothes were torn in many places. Together with the traces of mud and the stains of pastries, he looked extremely embarrassed. Sang Sang, who was walking beside him, was not much better. She was covered in dust, and there were many grass chips on her hair and shoulders. She looked dirtier and older than the big black umbrella she carried on her back. However, in the eyes of the students of the academy, the master and the handmaiden who were walking slowly were shrouded in the spring breeze, and looked very clean and bright, as if they had become a part of the spring breeze and the morning light. This was the so-called scenery. Ning Ke walked to the front of his classmates and took out the handkerchief from his chest pocket. He shook it twice in the air to shake off the pastry crumbs. Then he smiled and handed it to Chu Yuxian, whose face was full of fatigue but eyes were burning with passion. Since the semester examination, Ning Ke had spent more than half a year in the academy. It was not too bad for him, but there were not too many good things. Other than the old library, the meadow and the sword forest, there were only those friends who insisted on being friendly to him. There was no doubt that Ning Ke's best quality was to hold a grudge. But what was worth remembering was the real hatred that could only be washed away with blood, and not the rumors that could not shake his emotions. Correspondingly, he could also remember favors. Whether it was Cao Xiaoshu, Chen Pipi, or the two people in front of him, they were all people he would never forget. Ning Ke looked at Situilan, who was standing in the morning light in an arrow suit, and said with a smile, "I rarely let my friends down. My brain was blocked by shit today, and it took me 5 or 6 hours to write it out. Fortunately, I have a day off tomorrow, and I can adjust. This is probably the advantage of having a day off every week. Have a good weekend, and see you on Sunday." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 162. Situilan didn't wear the academy's spring clothes today, but a crimson archery outfit. She didn't have any makeup on her face, and her eyes were as delicate as a painting. The somewhat mature crimson outfit was worn by her. She stood in the morning light and looked at Ning Quebec. Her eyes were full of pure joy. Especially after hearing Ning Ke's words, the smile in her eyes suddenly became brighter. The expressions of the academy students were very complicated. They didn't know what they should do or say at this time to dilute the embarrassment and sense of shame in their hearts. Over a dozen recommended students from the military ministry had walked out at some point in time. They walked in front of Ning Ke and bowed in a very formal manner. Chang Jingming, who was in the lead, looked at Ning Ke's face and said, "We apologize to you." Ning Ke looked at them and didn't say anything. Chang Jingming looked at the expression on his face and explained after a short pause, "It's not because you won the competition, or because you entered the second floor, or even because you won against those people from West Hill on behalf of the academy. The reason I apologize is actually very simple. It's because I was wrong. I shouldn't have doubted your character before figuring out the truth." Ning Ke laughed and said, "We are all from the military. Don't make it too complicated. Last year you once said that you would give me a chance to correct my name. Although I refused, I know you mean well. As for why I refused at that time, the reason is actually very simple. Because I don't need to correct my name, and my character has never been good." Chang Jingming slightly smiled and stepped aside. Then a few more academy students came out and seemed to want to follow this wave to apologize to Ning Quebec. Ning Ke didn't see Xie Chengyun, but he saw Zhong Dajuan with a somewhat embarrassed expression and a few grade A dormitory students who made the most noise in the semester exam. He didn't want to waste time on these small things, and he also didn't want these people to lightly say sorry and erase the past 6 months and stories. He was willing to let these people keep this pressure in their hearts. He knew it would make these people very unhappy and uncomfortable. Thinking of this, he felt very good and happy. After bidding farewell to Situilan and Chu Yuxian, and nodding to Chang Jingming and those recommended students from the military ministry, he did not even bother to look at the grade A dormitory students and walked out of the academy with Sang Sang. Zhong Dajuan clenched his fists tightly and looked at Ning Ke's back with an ugly expression. He shouted unhappily, "Ning Ke, if you are not willing to accept our apology, I have nothing to say. You did enter the second floor and you defeated Prince Long Qing. You used the truth to humiliate us for misunderstanding you. But are you so intoxicated with the pride of a winner?" Hearing the voices coming from behind, Ning Ke stopped and looked back at Zhong Dajuan and those so-called classmates who seemed to want to apologize but were actually disappointed and unwilling. He said, "First of all, it's not a misunderstanding. Not all accusations of indifference can be explained as a misunderstanding. Maybe you can explain it to others, but not to me. I won't accept it. Secondly, you are not worthy of my humiliation. My goal is to enter the second floor. Even Prince Longqing is not my goal, let alone you. However, since this fact has humiliated you, I will gladly accept this fact. Finally, about pride. Pride is the most precious quality of us Tangs, and I am not proud because I defeated Prince Longqing today and entered the second floor. Last year, Chang Zhengming wanted to give me a chance to prove myself, but I refused. I said it was because I did not need it. Why not?" In the morning light, Ning Ke held Sang Sang in his arms and proudly looked at his classmates from the academy, who had complicated expressions on their faces. He said, "Because I have always been proud. I didn't suddenly become proud at this moment. It's just that you didn't understand my pride at that time, or even now. You are not good enough to understand it." After saying these words about pride, Ning Ke did not say another word and directly walked out of the academy. The students of the academy stared at his back like birds carved out of wood. Zhong Dajuan's face turned red and he clenched his fists tightly, but he could not say a word. Chang Zhengming sighed. Situilan shook her head and smiled bitterly. She thought that since she thought that Ning Ke was not good enough, and he had fallen into the water, why did he have to slap him again before leaving? Walking out of the gate of the academy, Ning Ke saw two people. He respectfully bowed to Professor Huang, he who presided over the ceremony of the second floor on the right side. Professor Huang he smiled at him as if he was looking at the silver hidden under his bed. He gently stroked his long beard and nodded, which was very comforting. Ning Ke did not know the dirty old Taoist on the left side, but he guessed his identity, so he more respectfully bowed to him. Looking at the clean young man in front of him, Master Yen Sei's triangular eyes were full of brilliance, without the usual wretchedness. He was like an old grandfather who finally held his grandson before his death. He sighed with emotion and said, "I think you have already known the final result. If you have free time in the future, you can follow me to learn some small skills of drawing talismans." The divine talisman master was a great figure in the world. It was really a rare lucky chance to learn talisman Taoism from him. Ning Ke had already known the result of the dispute from Chen Pipi. Hearing Master Yen Sei's words, he could not suppress his excitement anymore. Eunuch Lin looked at him with a smile and said, "Did you go to the imperial study one day last spring?" Ever since he entered the academy, Ning Ke had focused all his attention on climbing the stairs and cultivating. He had even forgotten that he was a secret guard of the Tang Empire. As for the calligraphy he had written in the imperial study, he had long forgotten about it. Although the wonderful feeling of catharsis still lingered in his heart, Eunuch Lin's words were like a bolt of lightning that directly awakened all his memories. Although his expression remained calm, his heart was already trembling with shock. He thought to himself, could it be that the palace found out that he had entered the imperial study without permission and decided to punish him? But the meaning of his calligraphy was ancient and completely different from the usual ink. How could the palace be sure that it was him? And even if they wanted to punish him, it should be the bodyguard office's business. How could such a bigwig like Eunuch Lin take action? In a flash, Ning Ke thought of many things. It was said that the emperor was famous for his kindness. Now that he had become a disciple of the second floor of the academy and a student of Master Yen Sei, and it was said that the South School of Haotian also thought highly of him, he should not be beheaded for such a small crime, right? In a flash, He weighed many problems and finally said honestly, yes. He tried to appear calm and aboveboard, but everyone could hear that his voice was nervous and dry. Eunuch Lin touched his smooth chin and looked at him with a smile. It really is you. That's good. But this is a serious matter. To confirm it before entering the palace, I asked His Majesty a question. Please speak, Eunuch Lin, Ning Ke said. Eunuch Lin looked into his eyes and asked with a smile, His Majesty asked you, what is the sentence before, the flower blooms on the shore? Ning Ke murmured, the fish jumps into the sea. Then what are you waiting for? Hurry up and follow me into the palace. Eunuch Lin looked at him and said with a smile, My Sir Ning. Because of the silence at the entrance of the academy, the gathered students also quietened down and listened to the discussion curiously. But because of the distance, they could not hear clearly and could only hear a few words occasionally floating over. Master Yen Sei is going to take that lucky guy as a student. What is he still doing there? Which prince's mansion does that eunuch come from? What are they talking about? It seems like they are going to some prince's mansion. A student guessed. Jean Wuxia looked at the royal carriage outside the academy and hesitated. She murmured the words she heard, the sea. The shore. His Majesty has waited for half a year. What does this mean? After sending breakfast to Xie Qingyun, who temporarily stayed in the academy last night, she returned to the gate of the academy and was ready to go home with Situilan. She did not hear the previous apology and proud remarks, but heard the last conversation. Suddenly, an incredible emotion surged in her eyes. Looking at Ning Ke beside the carriage, she murmured in a slightly trembling voice, Is the calligraphy in the imperial study written by Ning Ke? Her voice was very low, but it was clearly heard by the students of the academy. In an instant, the inner stone square fell into absolute silence. Everyone knew that the calligraphy that Jean Wuxia mentioned, which was left in the imperial study by someone, was deeply loved by His Majesty. It was said that His Majesty would go to the imperial study to look at that calligraphy in a daze whenever he was upset about state affairs. What was more clear was that His Majesty had invited many calligraphers to the palace to copy that calligraphy, and then selected the best ones to be bestowed to the ministers and scholars in the imperial court, in order to replace those really meaningless rewards in the past. Even in the Tang Empire with simple folk customs, it was the same. His Majesty loved calligraphy, especially the literati and officialdom loved calligraphy. His Majesty loved that calligraphy, so did the ministers and scholars. His Majesty loved that calligraphy, and naturally, the ministers and scholars were not willing to be left behind. This trend became more and more popular, and finally became an interesting thing. Every time the ministers in the imperial court argued about how to get a wife, they would actually talk about this calligraphy. The grand scholar said that the emperor bestowed the first copy to him, and the minister said that the copy the emperor bestowed to him was the most exquisite double-hook copy that had the charm of the original. How could those copies of yours be compared to the one hanging in my study room? The ministers who had seen them blooming on the opposite shore, in the imperial study, all agreed with His Majesty's appreciation. They thought that it was indeed the most charming book in the past 10 years. Even without the blessing of His Majesty's love, it was still a rare masterpiece. In addition, the above-mentioned interesting things, the mysterious calligrapher had not appeared for a long time, and the strange appearance of the calligraphy in the imperial study added a layer of mystery to this calligraphy. Only mystery could be sacred in the world. The calligraphy and the mysterious calligrapher were getting more and more popular, and people were getting more and more curious. Today, the 5 words, a calligraphy piece moves Chang'an, were really extremely appropriate. The students of the academy had also taken great interest in this matter, and the children of powerful officials like Jean Wuxia and Miss Gao even had the opportunity to see those copies with their own eyes. But who would have thought that person was Ning Quebec, Chen Zixian looked at Ning Ke, who was standing beside the royal carriage, and suddenly said timidly, "When we talked about that calligraphy last year, I told you that Ning Ke opened a small calligraphy and painting shop in the eastern city. That calligraphy piece might be written by him." No one answered him. There was a silence on the stone platform, a silence of shock and embarrassment. In fact, there were many students in classroom 3 who remembered the discussion last year. They also remembered how they had mocked and ridiculed Chen Zixian after he had made such a cowardly guess. They had pointed at Chen Zixian's back in the rain-shielding corridor and laughed out loud. But who could still laugh at this moment? Ning Ke, who was regarded as a loser in cultivation and an immoral villain who gave up the exam because he was sick, had successfully climbed the mountain and surpassed those classmates who did not take him seriously. Finally, he defeated the invincible Prince Long Qing. This fact was like a thunder to the students of the academy. The highly respected divine talisman master did not hesitate to cry and shout to accept Ning Ke as a student. This matter was like a second thunder to the students of the academy. After the 2 thunder sounds, most people had been struck silly by the thunder. They could only rely on their survival instinct to force themselves to find the last spiritual escape channel and exit. At this moment, the 3rd thunder sounded. Ning Ke was the calligrapher who wrote the flower blooms on the shore of the opposite shore. He was about to enter the palace to meet the emperor, and he could see a brighter and broader future than most of the people present. After the 3rd thunder, the academy students standing on the stone platform no longer had any reason to continue to be proud, indifferent, innocent, argue, question, or refuse. They were directly struck into countless silent scorched trees, with smoke rising from their heads and their clothes turning into black brittle pieces. Their brains had long stopped working. The louder they had laughed, the hotter their faces were now. The more exaggerated they had laughed, the more they wanted to dig a big hole in front of them. The more indifferent they used to be, the more humiliated they could not control their eyes and looked at the royal carriage. I once heard Ning Ke say a very new word. Situilan suddenly said faintly, "That word is aesthetic fatigue. I have never understood how to judge beauty, and then how to feel tired. Today I finally understand the meaning of this sentence. It is easy to become numb and boring to be shocked too much." Chu Yuxian stood behind her, shaking his head and saying with a smile, "But I still feel very good." Situilan laughed and waved her fist. She looked at the academy students around her and said, "It is indeed very good." She looked at Zhong Dajuan, whose face was pale. Zhong Dajuan subconsciously turned his face away and did not dare to look back. She looked at the student from Yangguan beside Zhong Dajuan and said, "I remember someone once said that if that calligraphy was written by Ning Ke, he would be willing to kiss Ning Ke's smelly feet." The student was terrified and kept retreating. Situilan smiled and said, "I can ask Ning Ke to throw his shoes over. After climbing the mountain for a day and a night, they should be very smelly." The student screamed and then fell straight down. He had actually fainted because of this sentence. 4 horse carriages sped along the straight and spacious streets of Chang'an. From time to time, the shouts of the bodyguards could be heard. The pedestrians all moved away and then cursed at the dust on the road. The Tang Empire had always been particular about rules. Although they clearly saw that it was a carriage from the palace, the people of Chang'an city did not show any mercy to such an unruly carriage. Ning Ke and Sang Sang sat in the dim carriage and were a little bewildered by the luxurious decorations in the carriage. They looked at each other from time to time and exchanged their feelings. Both master and servant had seen many big scenes and large amounts of money. However, sitting in the royal carriage and officially entering the palace to meet His Majesty, they still could not help but feel a little nervous. "Don't be nervous. His Majesty loves your calligraphy very much." Eunuch Lin looked at him and comforted him. They had just left the back of the mountain of the academy and then entered the palace. It was indeed difficult for Ning Ke to wake up in a short time. After hesitating for a moment, he asked with uncertainty, Eunuch Lin, are you sure that His Majesty really likes my calligraphy and summoned me to the palace and not for other reasons? Eunuch Lin was startled and did not know whether to laugh or cry. He said, your flower blooms on the shore has already caused such a stir in Chang'an City. Did you really not know? Ning Ke finally relaxed and said with a smile, apart from cultivation, what I like the most is promotion and wealth. If I had known that His Majesty liked my calligraphy and was still looking for me, I would have walked right into the trap. No, I would have brought the most wonderful calligraphy I have ever written and barged into the imperial city, shouting that it was me, it was me. I'm just afraid that I would be beaten back by the guards. Eunuch Lin laughed and looked at him meaningfully. He said, if you could really barge into the imperial city with your calligraphy, the Yulin royal guards would definitely not let you in. However, why would the guards beat you? Ning Ke's heart skipped a beat. Eunuch Lin looked at him with a smile and said, you entered the palace and the imperial study without permission. Do you think that the palace would not investigate this matter and let His Majesty see you? I know that you are a secret guard and I also know your relationship with Cao Xiaoshu. Ning Ke was speechless. Eunuch Lin sighed and said, although the eastern city is a poor place and people rarely talk about these things, since you are the owner of a painting and calligraphy shop, you should know about the discussions among your peers. I really don't know what you have been doing for the past year. I rarely interact with my peers. As for the past half a year, I have been busy studying. Ning Ke thought of the leaves, silver ingots, and brush and ink in the old brush pen shop and smiled. Suddenly, he remembered an important matter and his smile disappeared. He asked Eunuch Lin to return to Lin 47th Street to wash up. Hearing this request, Eunuch Lin was extremely displeased. His Majesty had waited for you for half a year, but you were not in a hurry to thank him. Instead, you were in a hurry to go home and wash up. What was the meaning of this? Did I not explain the rules clearly to you before? The palace would naturally let you wash up before the audience. However, for some reason, Ning Ke was exceptionally stubborn and insisted on returning to Lin 47th Street. Eunuch Lin was helpless against his argument. Thinking that His Majesty admired this young student so much and did not want to make things too awkward, he agreed to his request. Lin 47th Street was exceptionally beautiful in spring. A few peach blossoms poked out of the wall of the Ministry of Revenue's warehouse and looked curiously at the shop across the street. At dusk yesterday, the nation master of Tang, Li Qingshan, and the others personally came to Lin 47th Street to examine Ning Ke's handwriting. At that time, they had entered violently and the door of the old brush pen shop was forcefully pushed down. The scene was a mess. Ning Ke looked at the open door and secretly cursed in his heart. He jumped off the horse carriage and rushed inside. The proprietress of the fake antique shop next to him shouted, "Don't worry, nothing is missing. I helped you look after it all night." Ning Ke looked back at the proprietress and felt that the thick layer of makeup on her face had made her more beautiful than ever. He went forward and gave her the warmest hug. He said joyfully, "Aunt Wu, thank you so much, thank you so much." The owner of the fake antique shop stood at the door with a teapot in his hand. Seeing this scene, he said unhappily, "Don't hug me even if you're grateful. That's my wife." Ning Ke laughed and said, "Of course I know she's your wife, and your only wife." The owner of the fake antique shop smiled proudly and took a sip of tea. He said, "Who can tell?" The proprietress was about to lose her temper, but Ning Ke stopped her and said with a smile, "Aunt Wu, don't worry. I owe you a favor today. Second brother Wu will never marry another wife in this life. I'll look after him for you." The proprietress beamed and repeatedly agreed. Second brother Wu said angrily, "You little thing, how dare you meddle in my family affairs? Ning Ke pointed at the royal horse carriage behind him and asked with a smile, "Can you meddle in this?" Second brother Wu saw the emblem on the bright yellow horse carriage clearly and thought of his miserable life in the future. He suddenly trembled with fear. Walking into the dark old brush pen shop, Ning Ke did not ask Sang Sang to boil water for a bath. Instead, he reluctantly closed the shop door and climbed up the wall on the stool as fast as he could. He took down the scrolls hanging on the wall with his own handwriting. He solemnly handed the scrolls to Sang Sang and said with a solemn expression, "From now on, you must take care of any piece of paper I write as if it were a big black umbrella." Sang Sang opened her eyes and asked confusedly, "As long as the paper exists, I will exist. If the paper dies, I will die. This is not a piece of paper." Ning Ke gently stroked the scrolls in Sang Sang's hands and said with a slightly trembling voice, "These are all silver notes. I like the content of the second half of the chapter, and I especially like the title. Also, I have something to report to everyone. Jiang Ye's book always sends out individual chapters to solicit votes at midnight on Monday. This good habit will be maintained. It's just that some of my friends are very generous and use text messages to notify me. I'm very grateful. But the chapter at midnight is a chapter for soliciting votes. Please don't get up to read it, or I'll be very embarrassed. I'm cupping my hands. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.